Close your eyes and imagine a world blanketed in snow, where the smell of roasting boar fills stone halls lit only by flickering torches. Picture a time when Christmas wasn't just one day but 12 days of feasting, mystery, and rituals so strange they'd blow your mind. Tonight, we're traveling back 700 years to discover how medieval people really celebrated Christmas. And trust me, it was nothing like what you're imagining right now. Before we begin this journey through time, if you enjoy falling asleep to fascinating history, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for dreamless timelines. Your support keeps these stories coming, and honestly, it helps more than you know. Now, let's step back into a winter's night in the year 1350. The frost crept across the diamond-paned windows of Thornbury Manor like skeletal fingers reaching for warmth. Inside the great hall, Lady Alina wrapped her wool cloak tighter around her shoulders, watching as servants hauled an enormous Yule log through the massive oak doors. The log was so large it took 6 men to carry it, their breath forming clouds in the frigid December air. This wasn't just any piece of wood. This was an ash tree carefully selected months ago, blessed by the village priest, and kept dry in the barn specifically for this moment. The Yule log tradition went back further than anyone could remember, back to times when people worshipped older gods in darker forests. Thomas, the head steward, supervised the placement of the log into the great stone fireplace that dominated the hall's north wall. He was a meticulous man, his grey beard neatly trimmed despite the chaos of Christmas preparations swirling around him. Every detail mattered because Christmas in medieval England was the most important celebration of the entire year, more significant than Easter, more anticipated than Midsummer's Eve. The Yule log had to be lit using a piece of the previous year's log, which Thomas had carefully saved wrapped in linen in the buttery. This continuity connected past to present, the living to the dead, one generation to the next in an unbroken chain stretching back through the mists of time. Outside, snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that would have made any modern person reach for their phone to check the weather. But in 1350, there were no weather apps, no hourly forecasts, no meteorologists cheerfully predicting accumulation. People read the sky like a book, watched how animals behaved, felt changes in their bones. Old Margaret, the kitchen's head cook, had predicted this snowfall 3 days ago when she saw the pigs gathering extra straw for their beds. She'd been right, as she usually was, and now the manor was effectively cut off from the outside world. The nearest town, Ashford, lay 5 miles away down roads that were now impassable. This isolation was part of Christmas's magic in medieval times. When the snow came, communities turned inward, becoming self-contained worlds where time moved differently. The Great Hall of Thornbury Manor measured 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a ceiling that soared 25 feet above the rush-covered floor. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes hung on the walls, their threads faded but still showing the reds and golds that had once been vibrant. These weren't just decorations. They were insulation, keeping the brutal winter cold from seeping through the stone walls. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais, sat Lord William's high table, where the family and honoured guests would dine. Below it, 3 long trestle tables had been set up for the household staff, visiting relatives and important tenants who'd braved the weather to attend the Christmas feast. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Christmas in medieval times didn't start on December 25th. It began way back in early December with the season of Advent, a period of fasting and preparation that was taken seriously, and I mean seriously. While modern folks might give up chocolate or alcohol for Lent, medieval people faced strict dietary restrictions during Advent. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. Just fish, vegetables, bread, and whatever else the church deemed appropriate for spiritual preparation. This made the eventual Christmas feast even more anticipated, even more glorious, even more absolutely mind-blowing when it finally arrived. Young Edward, Lord William's eldest son, stood near the fireplace watching the Yule log catch flame. He was 17 years old, training to become a knight, and this would be his last Christmas before he left for service at the king's court. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face as he remembered Christmas celebrations from his childhood. Back then, everything had seemed magical, enormous, overwhelming. The mummers in their strange costumes, the Lord of Misrule turning everything upside down, the boar's head carried in on a silver platter while everyone sang. Now, standing on the edge of adulthood, he tried to hold on to that childlike wonder even as responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like armor. His sister Catherine joined him, her green dress rustling as she moved. At 15, she was considered of marriageable age, and their father had been negotiating with several families about potential matches. But Catherine had other ideas, dreams of joining a convent and spending her life in contemplation and learning. She taught herself to read Latin by sneaking into her brother's lessons with the family chaplain, and she developed a passion for the lives of saints that bordered on obsession. Her favorite was Saint Lucy, whose feast day fell on December 13th and marked an important milestone in the journey toward Christmas. If you're enjoying this journey back in time, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment about your favorite part of the story so far. It really does help the channel grow, and I love reading what resonates with you all. Alright, let's continue. The manor's chapel bell rang for Vespers, its bronze voice carrying across the snow-covered grounds. This was the signal for evening prayers, a daily ritual that structured medieval life as surely as mealtimes and work schedules. Religion wasn't separate from daily existence in the Middle Ages. It was woven into every moment, every decision, every celebration. Christmas was, first and foremost, a religious feast celebrating the birth of Christ. But layered on top of that Christian foundation were older traditions, pagan customs that had been absorbed and transformed, but never entirely erased. The Yule log itself came from pre-Christian winter solstice celebrations. The evergreen decorations brought indoors represented life persisting through death season. The feasting and drinking echoed ancient Roman Saturnalia festivals, where social order temporarily inverted. Lady Alina led the household into the chapel, a small stone building attached to the manor's east wing. The space was intimate, maybe holding 50 people if they squeezed together, and the walls were covered in frescoes depicting biblical scenes. Candlelight illuminated the images of shepherds and angels, wise men and stars, creating the illusion of movement as shadows flickered across painted faces. Father Benedict, the family's chaplain, stood at the altar preparing for the service. He was a young priest, only 28 years old, who'd come to Thornbury Manor 2 years earlier after completing his studies at Oxford. He possessed a scholar's mind and a poet's heart, and his sermons often left people thinking about ideas they'd never considered before. The evening service was sung in Latin, the ancient language of the church that most common people didn't understand. But they didn't need to understand the words to feel the music's power. The chant rose and fell like breathing, like waves, like wind moving through trees. These melodies had been sung for centuries, passed down from monk to monk, from generation to generation, connecting everyone in that small chapel to Christians across Europe and across time. When they sang the Magnificat, Mary's song of praise from the Gospel of Luke, Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. She imagined herself in Mary's place, young and frightened and blessed beyond comprehension, carrying God himself inside her body. After Vespers, the household returned to the Great Hall for supper. This wasn't the grand Christmas feast that would come on Christmas Day itself, but even the ordinary evening meal during the Christmas season was more elaborate than usual. The head table received roasted fish, a specialty pie made with lampreys, fresh bread, and hippocras, a spiced wine that was basically the medieval version of mulled wine. The lower tables got simpler fare: pottage, a thick vegetable stew that was the staple of medieval diet, along with dark bread and weak ale. Even the servants got ale instead of water because, fun fact, water in medieval times was often unsafe to drink. Brewing beer or ale killed the bacteria, making it the beverage of choice for everyone from nobles to peasants. As they ate, a travelling minstrel who'd arrived the previous week before the heavy snow began entertaining the hall with songs. His name was Geoffrey, and he played the lute with fingers that moved like spider legs across the strings. He sang about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, about Sir Gawain's encounter with the Green Knight, a story particularly appropriate for Christmas since that's when the tale was set. The Green Knight rode into Arthur's hall during the Christmas feast and challenged the knights to a deadly game. Sir Gawain accepted, beheaded the Green Knight with one blow, and then watched in horror as the Green Knight picked up his own severed head and reminded Gawain to meet him in 1 year for the return blow. Medieval people loved this story, this mix of chivalry and supernatural terror, this reminder that bargains made must be honoured no matter the cost. Edward listened intently to the tale, imagining himself in Sir Gawain's place. Would he have the courage to face the Green Knight? Would he keep his word even knowing it meant his death? These weren't just idle questions. Honour, reputation, and oath-keeping were the foundations of medieval society, especially for the knightly class. A man's word was literally his bond, and breaking an oath could mean exile, poverty, or worse. This was a world without contracts that could be enforced in courts, without credit scores or background checks. Trust was everything, and trust was earned through consistently keeping your promises no matter what. After supper, the household gathered around the roaring fire to share stories. This was the medieval version of primetime television, and people took it seriously. Old Margaret, released from her kitchen duties for a few hours, told tales she'd heard from her grandmother, who'd heard them from her grandmother, stretching back through generations. She spoke of the wild hunt, ghostly horsemen who rode across the sky during the 12 days of Christmas, collecting the souls of the damned. She warned about going outside after dark during Christmas season unless absolutely necessary, because the boundaries between the living world and the world of spirits grew thin and permeable. Creatures from folklore, fairies, goblins, the restless dead, could cross over more easily. Now, you might be thinking this sounds more like Halloween than Christmas, and you're not wrong. Medieval Christmas had a spooky element that modern celebrations have mostly lost. The long, dark nights of midwinter were considered dangerous, liminal time when anything could happen. The church tried to overlay these fears with Christian symbolism, Christ's light entering the world's darkness, good triumphing over evil, but the older beliefs persisted stubbornly. People might attend Mass devoutly, but they also put iron horseshoes above their doors to ward off malevolent spirits, and left out offerings of food for household fairies who could cause mischief if offended. Catherine loved these stories even though they frightened her, or perhaps because they frightened her. There was something thrilling about sitting in the warm, safe hall while Margaret described horrors lurking just beyond the walls. Young children pressed closer to their mothers, and even the men looked uneasy when Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper describing how the wild hunt sounded, baying hounds, thundering hooves, and terrible laughter that froze the blood. According to legend, anyone who saw the wild hunt would die within the year. Some said it was led by the devil himself. Others claimed the leader was an ancient pagan god, whose worship had never entirely died out in England's remote corners. Father Benedict didn't approve of these tales. He considered them superstitious nonsense that distracted from proper Christian teaching. But he was wise enough not to directly challenge old Margaret, who held more authority in the manor than her lowly position as head cook might suggest. She'd served the family for 40 years, had delivered both Lord William and his siblings, had nursed them through childhood illnesses when their survival seemed unlikely. She'd earned the right to speak, and people listened when she talked, even when she talked about things that made the young priest uncomfortable. As the hour grew late, Lord William himself rose to speak. The hall fell instantly silent. He was a man of maybe 50 years, his hair and beard shot through with grey, his face weathered by decades of outdoor activity. He'd fought in France as a young man during the early stages of the 100 Years' War, and he'd seen things he never spoke about, horrors that visited him sometimes in dreams. But now, standing before his household on this cold December night, he spoke about hope and community and gratitude. He thanked everyone for their service during the past year. He acknowledged the hardships they'd faced, a late spring, a wet summer that threatened the harvest, an outbreak of illness in the village that took several children. Despite everything, they'd survived, and that was worth celebrating. Stay with me now, because what I'm about to tell you about medieval Christmas traditions will absolutely blow your mind. We're just getting started. Lord William announced that the Christmas celebrations would officially begin on December 21st, the Feast of St. Thomas, which was just 3 days away. On that day, the estate's tenants would bring their rent payments, and in return they'd receive gifts of food and clothing from the Lord's stores. This wasn't pure generosity. It was part of the feudal system's complex web of obligations. Tenants owed labor and rent to their lord, but the lord owed protection and support to his tenants. Christmas was when these reciprocal relationships were affirmed and celebrated, when the social hierarchy was both reinforced and temporarily softened through generous giving. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. The kitchens became zones of controlled chaos as Margaret and her staff prepared for the enormous feast. They'd been working for weeks already, but now the pace intensified. Bread had to be baked, barrels of ale had to be checked, meat had to be butchered and hung. The manor's bakehouse ran day and night, producing hundreds of loaves because bread was the foundation of every meal. Medieval bread came in many varieties, from the fine white manchet bread served to nobles to the coarse dark maslin bread eaten by servants. The quality of bread you ate literally marked your social status. In the manor's stillroom, Lady Alina and her ladies prepared preserves, candied fruits and medicinal preparations. The stillroom was considered women's domain, a place where they exercised authority over matters of health, food preservation and household management. Alina took this responsibility seriously. She'd learned the recipes and techniques from her own mother and would pass them to Catherine when the time came. The knowledge was precious, passed down mother to daughter through generations. How to recognize herbs by sight and smell, how to prepare poultices for wounds, how to make syrups that soothed coughs, how to preserve summer's abundance for winter's scarcity. Catherine worked beside her mother, grinding spices with a mortar and pestle. The scents of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg filled the stillroom exotic fragrances that had traveled thousands of miles from distant lands. These spices cost a fortune, worth more than gold by weight, and using them liberally during Christmas was a display of wealth and status. The nobility didn't just eat to satisfy hunger. They ate to demonstrate their position in society, to prove they could afford luxuries that common people never tasted. A single peppercorn was precious. A handful of saffron threads represented serious money. The spice trade connected medieval Europe to Asia through trade routes that were themselves fascinating stories of adventure and danger. Edward spent his days practicing combat skills in the manor's courtyard despite the cold and snow. He trained with sword and shield, lance and mace, preparing for his future role as a knight. His instructor, Sir Robert, was a grizzled veteran who'd fought in a dozen battles and lived to tell about it. Sir Robert pushed Edward hard, harder than seemed necessary sometimes, but he explained that combat was no game. When you faced an enemy in battle, there were no second chances, no do-overs, no opportunity to say you weren't quite ready. You either fought skillfully or you died, and Sir Robert intended to make sure Edward survived his first real battle. The physical training was brutal. Edward wore full armor for hours, learning to move under the weight of chain mail and plate that could exceed 60 pounds. He practiced strikes until his arms ached, repeated defensive moves until they became instinctive. Sir Robert constantly reminded him that thinking took too long in combat. Your body had to know what to do before your mind consciously registered the threat. This kind of training took years, which is why knights started learning warfare as children. Edward had begun his martial education at age 7, and he still had years to go before he'd be considered fully proficient. On December 21st, St. Thomas's Day, the tenants began arriving at the manor despite the snow. They came on foot mostly, trudging through drifts that sometimes reached their knees, carrying what they owed in rent, bags of grain, chickens, a portion of whatever their land had produced. The rent collection happened in the manor's courtyard under Thomas the steward's watchful eye. He recorded every payment in the estate's rent roll, a massive book where centuries of transactions would eventually be documented. Some tenants paid in coin, silver pennies that rang when dropped on stone. Others paid in kind, offering produce or labor instead of money. After each tenant paid, they received gifts from Lord William's stores. Lengths of wool fabric for making clothes, bags of flour, salted fish, small luxuries like candles or soap. This gift-giving wasn't optional charity. It was a required part of the Lord's obligations, a way of redistributing wealth that prevented the most desperate poverty while reinforcing the social structure. The Lord's generosity reminded tenants of their dependence on his goodwill, while simultaneously requiring him to share some of his wealth with those below him. It was a delicate balance, this feudal system, and it worked more or less effectively for centuries. Young Tom, a tenant farmer's son about Edward's age, brought his family's rent payment. Tom and Edward had played together as children before their social positions began to diverge. Now they greeted each other with a mixture of warmth and awkwardness. Edward felt the distance between them, a gulf created by birth and circumstance rather than choice. In another life, they might have been true friends, equals, but in medieval society, such friendship across class lines was nearly impossible. Everyone had their place, their role, their prescribed position in the social hierarchy. Moving outside those boundaries was uncomfortable at best, dangerous at worst. As night fell on St. Thomas's Day, the manor's great hall hosted a smaller feast for the visiting tenants. It wasn't as elaborate as the Christmas feast would be, but it was still generous: roasted chicken, fresh bread, plenty of ale. Musicians played, and people danced despite their exhaustion from traveling through snow. The dances were communal, everyone holding hands and moving in circles or lines, unlike the more formal couples dancing that would develop in later centuries. These folk dances had ancient roots, patterns and steps passed down orally through generations. No one wrote them down because most people couldn't read anyway. You learned by watching, by participating, by feeling the rhythm in your bones. Catherine watched the dancing from the edge of the hall, her foot tapping unconsciously to the music. Father Benedict approached, and they spoke about the approaching Christmas celebrations. He told her about the special masses planned, about the elaborate liturgy that would unfold over the 12 days of Christmas. Each day had its own feast, its own saints to honor, its own particular customs. December 26th was St. Stephen's Day, when alms were distributed to the poor. December 27th was St. John the Evangelist's feast, when wine was blessed. December 28th, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, commemorated the children Herod killed trying to murder the infant Jesus. This last feast day was observed with somber reflection, a reminder that Christmas's joy coexisted with the world's sorrow. Now here's something wild that you probably don't know about medieval Christmas. Are you ready for this? During the 12 days of Christmas, social order literally inverted. A boy bishop was elected, an actual child who got to dress in bishop's robes and mock the adult clergy. A lord of misrule was chosen to preside over festivities, turning everything upside down. Servants might dress as nobles, men might dress as women, and behavior that would normally get you punished was temporarily allowed. This inversion wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate safety valve, a controlled release of social tension that actually helped maintain order the rest of the year. By allowing brief, ritualized chaos, the system prevented real revolutionary impulses from building up. If you're still listening, thank you for sticking with this journey. Go ahead and drop a comment telling me what surprises you most so far about medieval Christmas. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that button and join our Dreamless Timelines community. December 24th arrived, Christmas Eve, and the manor buzzed with final preparations. This was the last day of Advent, the last day of fasting, and by evening the anticipation was almost unbearable. The great hall had been transformed with evergreen boughs, holly with its red berries, ivy climbing the wooden pillars. These decorations weren't just pretty, they carried deep symbolic meaning. Evergreens represented eternal life, holly's red berries symbolized Christ's blood. Ivy, which grew by clinging to other plants, represented humanity's dependence on God. The Christmas Eve feast began at sunset with a solemn procession. Father Benedict led the household into the hall carrying a tall candle representing Christ, the light of the world. Behind him came the family, then the servants, then any guests, everyone in strict hierarchical order. They took their places at the tables as the candle was placed on the high table where its flame could be seen by everyone. The meal was fish, as befitted the last day of Advent fasting, but it was the finest fish available: salmon, pike and lamprey prepared with expensive spices and elaborate sauces. As they ate, Father Benedict told the story of Christ's birth, the familiar tale of Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem, finding no room at the inn, settling in a stable where animals were kept. He described the baby born in poverty and laid in a manger, a feeding trough for animals. He spoke about shepherds in the fields who saw angels announcing the birth, about wise men following a star from the distant east. The story was so familiar that everyone could have recited it, but hearing it again in the candlelit hall on Christmas Eve gave it fresh power. Catherine pictured Mary holding her newborn son, the creator of the universe, small and vulnerable and dependent on human care. After the meal, the household attended midnight mass, the most important service of the Christmas season. They walked through snow to the chapel, carrying torches that created pools of light in the darkness. The chapel was decorated even more elaborately than the hall, with candles everywhere, more greenery and special cloths covering the altar. Father Benedict had spent hours preparing for this mass, practicing the complex liturgy until he could perform it flawlessly. The service would last nearly 2 hours, involving multiple readings, special prayers, and elaborate chanting. The Mass began with the intrite, the entrance hymn, sung in Latin that flowed like honey. Dominus dixit ad me, filius meus es tu ego hodie genui te. The Lord said to me, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." The words echoed off stone walls, creating harmonies that seemed supernatural, as if angels themselves were singing. Catherine closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, transport her, lift her beyond the ordinary world into something transcendent. This, she thought, was why she wanted to join a convent. This experience of touching the divine through prayer and music and ritual. The Mass proceeded through its ancient structure. Readings from Isaiah prophesying the Messiah's birth, the Gospel according to Luke describing the Nativity, prayers of consecration transforming ordinary bread and wine into Christ's body and blood through the miracle of transubstantiation. Medieval people took this literally, absolutely seriously. The Eucharist wasn't symbolic, it was real transformation, as real as snow or stone or steel. Receiving communion meant physically consuming God, incorporating the divine into your own flesh. The theology was complex, debated by scholars, but for most people it was simply accepted as mysterious truth beyond human understanding. When the Mass ended, dawn was breaking, Christmas Day arriving with pale winter light. The household returned to the manor exhausted but exhilarated. Normally they'd sleep before the Christmas feast, but there was too much to do, too much excitement, too much anticipation. The cooks had been working all night preparing the feast, and delicious smells filled every corner of the building. Roasting meat, baking bread, spiced wine warming on the fire. This would be a meal remembered all year, talked about for months, the pinnacle of winter's celebrations. Before the feast, there was one more crucial ritual, the ceremonial bringing in of the boar's head. This was a tradition dating back to pagan times when boars were sacred animals associated with fertility and winter survival. The boar for Thornbury Manor's feast had been hunted weeks earlier, a massive creature weighing over 300 pounds that had taken 5 hunters and a pack of hounds to bring down. Its head had been preserved, decorated with bay leaves and rosemary, an apple placed in its jaws. Now 6 servants carried it into the hall on a massive silver platter, while everyone sang the boar's head carol, an ancient song that mixed Christian and pagan imagery without apology. The boar's head was placed on the high table before Lord William, who stood and raised his cup. He offered a toast to the king, to the church, to everyone gathered. Then he carved the first slice from the boar, the signal that the feast could begin. And what a feast it was. Course after course emerged from the kitchens in a display of abundance that would seem obscene to modern sensibilities, but was perfectly normal for medieval Christmas. Roasted venison, beef, mutton, and pork. Whole swans and peacocks, their feathers replaced after cooking to create spectacular visual displays. Meat pies so large they required 2 servants to carry them. Fish dishes for those who preferred them. Vegetables cooked in butter and wine. Frumenty, a wheat porridge mixed with milk and spices that was a Christmas staple. Subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures depicting religious or mythological scenes that were artworks before they were food. Edward had been looking forward to this feast for months, and it exceeded even his highest expectations. He ate until he thought he'd burst, then ate some more because the food kept coming and refusing would be insulting to the cooks. He drank wine mixed with honey and spices until his head spun pleasantly. Around him, the hall roared with conversation and laughter. People sang between courses, told jokes, shared gossip about neighbors. The formal social structure relaxed during the feast, and even servants at the lower tables ate well and enjoyed themselves without fear of punishment for being too loud or too merry. Geoffrey the minstrel earned his keep that day, performing song after song, story after story. He sang about Roland at Roncesvalles, about Tristan and Isolde's doomed love, about Robin Hood in Sherwood Forest. Between songs, tumblers and acrobats performed, doing flips and balancing on each other's shoulders while the audience gasped and applauded. A juggler kept 7 balls in the air simultaneously, a feat that seemed almost magical. Entertainment was live in medieval times. No recordings, no replays, no ability to pause and rewind. You watched the performance or you missed it, which made people appreciate it more, pay attention more carefully, remember it more vividly. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the Lord of Misrule made his appearance. This year's Lord was Nicholas, one of the stable boys, a quick-witted 17-year-old known for his humor. For the next 12 days, Nicholas would hold mock authority over the Christmas festivities, organizing games, leading processions, generally causing harmless chaos. He wore an absurd crown made of brass and colored ribbons, carried a wooden scepter, and spoke in pompous tones that parodied noble speech. His first decree was that everyone had to sing a song or tell a story before they could leave the table. Groans mixed with laughter as people realized they'd have to perform. Old Margaret, surprisingly nimble for her age, stood and sang a bawdy ballad about a knight and a miller's daughter that made the younger servants blush and the older ones roar with laughter. Father Benedict looked scandalized but said nothing. The Lord of Misrule's authority superseded even his during Christmas season. One by one, people performed. Some sang, some recited poetry, some told jokes. When Catherine's turn came, she sang a hymn in her clear, sweet voice, and for a moment the hall fell completely silent, everyone caught by the beauty of her singing. Even Nicholas, the Lord of Misrule, looked moved. Edward, when called upon, told a story he'd heard from Sir Robert about a battle in France. He described the clash of arms, the smell of blood and mud, the screaming of horses. The weight of knowing your life depended on the man fighting beside you. It wasn't a happy story, but it was real and honest, and the hall listened intently. War was a constant presence in medieval life, even during peaceful times like Christmas. The nobility's entire purpose, the justification for their privileges and wealth, was their readiness to fight when needed. Edward's story reminded everyone of the serious responsibilities waiting beyond the Christmas festivities. The feast continued until full darkness fell. Servants cleared away the remnants of the meal, though there was still enough food left to feed the household for days. Nothing would go to waste. Leftovers would be redistributed to the poor, given to servants for their families, or preserved for future meals. In a world where hunger was never far away, where crop failures could mean starvation, where winter supplies had to last until spring, wasting food was unthinkable. The Christmas feast's abundance was remarkable precisely because scarcity was normal. After dinner, games began in the Great Hall. People played Hoodman Blind, the medieval version of Blind Man's Bluff. They played Hot Cockles, where someone knelt blindfolded while others struck them and they had to guess who'd hit them. They played Bob Apple, trying to grab apples floating in a barrel of water using only their mouths. These games seemed simple, maybe even childish, but they brought genuine joy to people who had little entertainment outside holidays and festivals. No television, no internet, no electronic devices of any kind. Community entertainment was participatory. You didn't watch games, you played them. Catherine found herself partnered with young Tom, the tenant farmer's son, for a dancing game. They held hands and moved through the steps, and for a moment the social distance between them vanished. They were just two young people enjoying Christmas, laughing when they messed up the steps, caught up in music and movement and the joy of being alive. But when the dance ended, the distance reasserted itself. Tom bowed formally and returned to the lower tables while Catherine rejoined her family. The brief connection left her feeling oddly sad, mourning what could never be because of accidents of birth. Let me tell you something absolutely fascinating about medieval Christmas that makes it so different from today. The celebration didn't end on December 25th. In fact, December 25th was just the beginning. The 12 days of Christmas stretched until January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, when the wise men reached the baby Jesus. Each of those 12 days had its own character, its own customs, its own particular energy. And during all 12 days, normal work basically stopped. The manor continued functioning at a minimal level. Animals were fed, fires were tended, essential tasks were completed, but the heavy labor of agriculture and craft production ceased. This was a 12-day party, and everyone was invited. December 26th, St. Stephen's Day, was traditionally when the wealthy distributed alms to the poor. Lord William opened the manor's gates and invited anyone from the surrounding villages to come receive gifts. Hundreds of people lined up in the snow, and each received bread, a piece of salted meat, and a small copper coin. The giving went on for hours, and Lady Alina and Catherine helped distribute the gifts alongside Lord William and Edward. It was humbling to see the gratitude in people's eyes for what amounted to basics, to realize how precarious most people's existence was. Catherine felt her privilege acutely. She'd never missed a meal in her life, never gone to bed cold, never worried where her next meal would come from. Among the recipients of alms was an old woman named Anne who lived alone in a cottage at the forest's edge. She was rumored to be a witch, though no one dared say it too loudly. Anne had knowledge of herbs and healing that went beyond what most people understood, and sometimes sick people would visit her when the church's remedies failed. She accepted her gifts from Catherine with a sharp, knowing look that made the young woman uncomfortable. As Anne turned to leave, she paused and spoke so quietly only Catherine heard. "You'll find what you're seeking, child, but not where you expect." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd before Catherine could ask what she meant. That evening, the manor hosted a play performed by traveling players who'd arrived on Christmas Day. Medieval people loved drama, loved stories enacted before their eyes. The players performed a mystery play about the Nativity, with villagers taking the roles of Mary, Joseph, shepherds, and wise men. The acting was broad and exaggerated because the hall was packed with people, and those in the back needed to see and hear everything clearly. Young children in the audience gasped when angels appeared, laughed when the innkeeper refused Mary and Joseph room, and cooed when baby Jesus was revealed. The baby was actually the butcher's 2-month-old son, and he slept peacefully through his theatrical debut despite the noise and commotion. The mystery plays weren't just entertainment. They were teaching tools, ways of conveying biblical stories to people who couldn't read scripture themselves. Illiteracy was the norm in medieval times. Even many nobles couldn't read. They learned history and law through oral instruction, memorized important information, and employed scribes for written communication. The plays made complex theological concepts accessible through visual storytelling, humor, and emotional engagement. Watching Mary's fear and Joseph's confusion made the nativity story real in ways that simply hearing it read in Latin never could. December 27th was St. John's Day, when wine was blessed and consumed in his honor. This was serious business because wine represented Christ's blood, and drinking blessed wine was believed to offer protection against poison and evil spirits. Lord William's wine cellar held hundreds of barrels and bottles accumulated over decades, and on St. John's Day he was generous with his supply. Even the servants received good wine instead of their usual ale, and by evening the entire household was pleasantly drunk, singing songs with more enthusiasm than skill. Father Benedict conducted the wine blessing ceremony in the chapel, invoking St. John's protection over all who would drink. The prayer was elaborate, filled with complex theological references that went over most people's heads, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the ritual itself, the sense of participating in something ancient and sacred, something that connected them to Christians across Europe and throughout history. After the blessing, everyone drank deeply, toasting St. John, toasting each other, toasting the Christ child whose birth they celebrated. Edward found himself talking with Sir Robert late into the night, both of them more honest than they'd usually be thanks to the blessed wine loosening their tongues. Sir Robert told stories about his youth, about battles he'd survived through luck as much as skill, about friends who hadn't survived at all. He spoke about the weight of taking a life, how it changed you in ways you couldn't predict, how the faces of men he'd killed sometimes visited him in dreams decades later. Edward listened, trying to absorb wisdom that couldn't be taught through sword practice or tactical instruction. War wasn't glorious, Sir Robert told him. War was necessary sometimes, but it was never glorious, never clean, never something to seek out for its own sake. December 28th arrived with the Feast of the Holy Innocents, commemorating the children King Herod murdered trying to kill the infant Jesus. This was the darkest day of the Christmas season, a reminder that joy and sorrow coexisted in the world, that celebration couldn't erase suffering. The mood in the manor shifted perceptibly. People spoke more quietly, moved more carefully, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. Children were honored on this day, given small gifts and exempted from chores. Parents held their sons and daughters a little tighter, grateful for their presence, aware of how quickly everything could be lost. Lady Alina spent the day in prayer, thinking about the 3 children she'd lost to illness before they reached their 5th birthdays. 2 daughters and a son, buried in the churchyard under small stone markers worn smooth by wind and rain. Medieval childhood was perilous, a gauntlet of diseases that killed without warning or mercy. Measles, smallpox, scarlet fever, simple infections that turned deadly, any of these could take a healthy child in days. Parents lived with constant low-level fear that never entirely disappeared, even when their children grew old enough to be relatively safe. Elena had been blessed with Edward and Catherine surviving to near adulthood, but she never forgot the three who hadn't. Catherine accompanied her mother to the churchyard that afternoon. They knelt in the snow beside the small grave and prayed, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Catherine had only vague memories of her siblings. She'd been very young when they died, but she felt their absence nonetheless. The family that existed was haunted by the family that might have been, by the brothers and sisters who never grew up, never became real people with distinct personalities and independent lives. Medieval families were shaped as much by death as by life, by absence as much as presence. Father Benedict's sermon that day spoke about the problem of suffering, about why God allowed innocents to die, about how human understanding was limited and incomplete. He quoted from the book of Job, about Job demanding answers from God and God responding not with explanations, but with questions that demonstrated the vast gulf between divine and human perspective. It wasn't a comforting sermon exactly, but it was honest. It acknowledged that faith didn't erase pain, didn't make loss easier, didn't provide simple answers to impossible questions. Faith was about trust despite not understanding, about continuing to believe even when belief felt difficult or foolish. That evening, the household gathered quietly in the great hall. There was no feast, no games, no entertainment. People sat by the fire and talked softly, sharing memories of those they'd lost. Old Margaret spoke about her son, dead 20 years in the wars, whose body she'd never recovered to bury properly. Thomas the steward remembered his wife, taken by fever the same year they married, leaving him alone before their life together really began. One by one, people named their dead, kept their memories alive through stories and prayers. This collective mourning was important, a recognition that everyone carried grief, that loss was universal rather than individual. Stay with me now, because tomorrow the mood will shift again. Medieval Christmas was this wild emotional roller coaster, moving from joy to sorrow and back to joy, never staying in one place too long. December 29th brought the murder of Thomas Becket back into collective memory. Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, had been killed by knights acting on King Henry II's frustrated wishes exactly 179 years earlier, in 1170. His martyrdom had shocked England and all of Christian Europe, transforming him instantly into a saint. People made pilgrimages to his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral, seeking miracles and healing. Becket represented the Church's power to challenge even kings, to insist that spiritual authority outranked temporal authority, that God's law superseded human law. Father Benedict spoke about Becket during the morning mass, describing how the Archbishop had refused to submit to the king's attempts to control church courts and church property. The conflict escalated until Henry, in a moment of rage, supposedly asked, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took this as a command and murdered Becket in Canterbury Cathedral while he was preparing for evening prayers. They struck him down in front of the altar, his blood mixing with holy water, his brains spilling onto the stone floor. The murder of a priest in a church was about the worst sacrilege imaginable, and Henry had to do public penance to avoid excommunication. The story fascinated Edward because it illustrated the complex relationship between church and state, between religious and secular power. Who really ruled England, the king or the pope? To whom did a Christian owe ultimate loyalty? These weren't abstract theological questions. They had real consequences, as Becket's murder demonstrated. Edward would have to navigate these tensions himself as an adult, balancing his duties to his earthly lord with his obligations to God. Medieval people didn't see any contradiction in fighting for the church or dying for their faith. Religion and politics were inseparable, woven together into a single fabric. The afternoon brought a return to celebration with the arrival of mummers, traveling performers who went from manor to manor during the Christmas season performing traditional plays. These weren't the formal mystery plays about biblical stories. These were folk dramas with roots so ancient no one knew where they came from. The mummers wore bizarre costumes, animal masks, ragged clothes, faces painted with ash or berry juice. They carried bells that jingled when they moved, and they spoke in strange voices that seemed to come from somewhere other than normal human speech. The performance they gave at Thornbury Manor was a version of a play that existed in hundreds of variations across England. It featured stock characters, St. George the Dragon, Turkish knight, and a doctor who could resurrect the dead. The plot was absurd. St. George fought and killed the dragon, then fought and killed the Turkish knight, then the doctor brought everyone back to life so they could do it all again. But underneath the absurdity lay serious themes: death and resurrection. Christianity overcoming paganism, English heroism defeating foreign threats. The mummers' play was everything mixed together: comedy and violence, Christianity and older magic, sophisticated symbolism, wrapped in crude presentation. The household loved it. Children shrieked when the dragon appeared, laughed when the doctor used ridiculous fake medicine to revive the dead knights. Adults appreciated the play's deeper meanings while enjoying its surface entertainment. After the performance, the mummers passed a hat for payment, and Lord William filled it generously with silver coins. The mummers would travel to the next manor tomorrow, carrying their strange traditions across the countryside, connecting scattered communities through shared stories and rituals. December 30th arrived cold and clear, the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Edward convinced several friends, other young men from neighboring estates who'd come for Christmas, to go hunting. They needed venison for the continuing feasts, but mostly they wanted adventure, wanted to escape the manor's confines and feel alive in winter's harsh beauty. They bundled in furs and wool, armed themselves with bows and hunting spears, and set out into the forest with a pack of eager hounds. The forest in winter was a different world, silent except for wind moving through bare branches and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Snow lay thick under the trees, unmarked except for animal tracks: deer, rabbits, foxes, wolves. The young men followed their dogs deeper into the woods, following a trail that seemed promising. Edward felt his senses sharpen, felt himself becoming more alert, more present. This was what he'd been trained for, not courtly manners or book learning but physical prowess, the ability to track and kill. They found the deer in a small clearing, a magnificent stag with antlers that spread like tree branches. The stag saw them at the same moment they saw it, and for a heartbeat they all froze, predator and prey locked in mutual recognition. Then the stag bolted and the hunt began. The dogs gave chase, baying with excitement, and the young men ran after them, shouting to each other, caught up in the primal thrill of the pursuit. They ran for miles through the forest, losing the trail and finding it again, pushing their bodies to exhaustion. Finally, they cornered the stag against a rocky outcropping where it couldn't escape. Edward fitted an arrow to his bowstring, aimed carefully at the spot where the stag's heart beat beneath muscle and bone, and released. The arrow flew true, striking exactly where he'd aimed. The stag staggered, fell to its knees, and died within moments. Edward approached the fallen animal, feeling a complex mixture of triumph and regret. The stag had been magnificent, wild and free, and now it was dead because of him. He said a brief prayer, thanking God for the kill and asking forgiveness for taking life. A formula hunters repeated, but which Edward genuinely meant. They butchered the stag in the forest, saving the meat and hide while leaving the entrails for the forest's other inhabitants. Nothing went to waste in medieval times. The venison would feed people, the hide would become leather, the bones would be boiled for glue, the antlers would be carved into useful objects. The young men carried the meat back to the manor on poles, arriving well after dark, exhausted and exhilarated. The kitchen staff received the venison gratefully, already planning how to prepare it for tomorrow's feast. That night, Edward dreamed of the stag. In his dream, the animal spoke with a human voice, asking why it had to die. Edward tried to explain about hunger and winter and the need to eat, but his explanation sounded hollow even to himself. The stag looked at him with enormous brown eyes filled with sorrow and understanding, then transformed into a man wearing antlers, then dissolved into smoke. Edward woke before dawn, disturbed by the dream, wondering what it meant. Sir Robert had told him that taking life changes you. Maybe this was the beginning of that change. December 31st, the last day of the year, was traditionally a time for reflection and resolution. Medieval people believed that how you spent this day would influence the entire coming year, so they tried to be industrious, generous, and optimistic. Lady Alina organized the household to clean the manor thoroughly, sweeping out old rushes from the floors and laying fresh ones mixed with herbs, lavender, rosemary, meadowsweet, that would release pleasant scents when people walked on them. Windows were washed, furniture was polished, walls were scrubbed. The manor needed to enter the new year fresh and clean. Catherine helped with the cleaning, finding the physical labor oddly satisfying. She usually spent her time on more refined activities, embroidery, music, prayer, but there was something meditative about scrubbing floors, about seeing visible progress as dirt disappeared and stone emerged clean underneath. She worked alongside servant girls who normally she'd barely speak to, and they taught her work songs to make the labor go faster. The songs were often bawdy, full of innuendo about maidens and traveling merchants, knights and farmers' daughters, and Catherine blushed but sang along anyway. As evening approached, preparations began for the year's final feast. This wouldn't be as elaborate as Christmas Day's meal, but it would still be special, marking the transition from old year to new. The cooks prepared a dish called fermenty, a ceremonial porridge made from wheat berries boiled in milk and seasoned with cinnamon, sugar, and egg yolks. Every person in the manor would eat some fermenty at midnight, symbolically sharing the same food and thus reinforcing their community bonds. Rich or poor, noble or servant, everyone ate from the same pot on New Year's Eve. Lord William took the day to settle accounts with his various creditors and debtors. Medieval finances were complex, involving loans, credit arrangements, shares in joint ventures, obligations stretching back years. Keeping track of who owed what to whom required meticulous record-keeping and good memory. Thomas the steward spent hours with Lord William, going through the account books, noting what had been paid and what remained outstanding. Some debts would be forgiven as New Year's gestures of goodwill. Others would be called in. The process was as much about maintaining relationships as about money. Knowing when to press for payment and when to be lenient was an art that separated successful lords from failed ones. As midnight approached, the entire household gathered in the great hall for the year's final hours. Father Benedict led prayers of thanksgiving for the old year's blessings and prayers for protection in the coming year. He recited the names of everyone in the household who died during 1350, committing their souls to God's mercy. The list was longer than anyone wanted. Disease had taken several servants, an accident during harvest had killed a field worker, old age had claimed the previous steward. Each name was a reminder of mortality, of how quickly life could end, of how precious was each moment granted. At midnight exactly, marked by Father Benedict counting down the final seconds, everyone shared the ceremonial fermenty. They ate from wooden bowls, rich and poor alike using the same simple vessels. The taste was sweet and warming, the consistency thick and comforting. As they ate, they wished each other blessings for the new year. Wassail, they called out, an Anglo-Saxon word meaning be healthy. The drinking horns and cups went around the hall, everyone toasting everyone else, and for a moment, social distinctions dissolved in genuine community feeling. Now, here's something that'll make you understand why medieval people were so different from us. Are you ready? Time itself meant something different to them. They didn't have clocks marking hours and minutes and seconds. They measured time by the sun's position, by church bells ringing for prayers, by seasons and agricultural cycles. A year wasn't just 12 months in sequence. It was a circle, a wheel constantly turning, with the same festivals and holy days coming around again and again. New Year's Day wasn't really new in our sense. It was the wheel turning back to its starting point, everything repeating, history a cycle rather than linear progress. January 1st, New Year's Day itself, was both the feast of the circumcision of Christ and a day for gift-giving. This was when noble families exchanged presents, not on Christmas Day as modern tradition would have it. The gifts were symbolic as much as practical. A fine knife meant you valued someone's utility, gloves meant you wanted to protect them, a piece of jewelry meant you cherished them. Lord William gave Lady Elena a gold brooch shaped like a rose, exquisitely detailed, with each petal individually crafted. Elena gave William a new sword belt tooled with images of saints and angels, a reminder that Christian virtue should guide even martial activities. Edward received from his father a horse, a magnificent destrier that would be his battle mount when he became a knight. The horse was coal-black, standing 17 hands tall, bred specifically for war. Training such a horse cost a fortune and took years, but a knight without a proper horse was like a carpenter without tools. Edward named the horse Midnight and spent hours that day getting acquainted with him, learning his temperament, beginning the bonding process that would make them effective partners in combat. Catherine received from her mother a book, an extraordinary gift because books were incredibly valuable in medieval times. This particular book was a psalter, containing the Book of Psalms copied by hand in beautiful script and illuminated with intricate illustrations. The book's pages were vellum, made from calfskin, and the illustrations used gold leaf and expensive pigments ground from minerals and plants. Creating such a book took months of skilled labor, and the finished product was literally worth more than most people earned in a year. Catherine held it reverently, understanding the gift's significance. Her mother was acknowledging her spiritual inclinations, supporting her desire for a contemplative life. The day passed in relative quiet after the previous day's intensity. People rested, recovered from too much food and drink, prepared for the second phase of Christmas celebrations that would carry them to Epiphany. Young children played with new toys, carved wooden animals, simple dolls spinning tops. Adults talked, gossiped, shared plans for the coming year. Farmers discussed when to plow, merchants talked about trade opportunities, women shared concerns about managing households through winter's remaining months. January 2nd and 3rd passed similarly, a sort of intermission in the Christmas celebrations. The great feasts were done, but smaller meals continued to be more elaborate than ordinary days would bring. Entertainment continued, but at a lower key, storytelling rather than plays, quiet music rather than dancing. People caught their breath before the final celebrations leading to Epiphany. January 4th brought another tradition that might seem super weird to modern folks, wassailing the apple trees. Orchards were critically important in medieval agriculture, providing fruit for eating fresh, for making cider for preserving through the winter. Ensuring a good harvest next autumn required, people believed, performing the wassailing ceremony. On January 4th, the household processed to the manor's orchard carrying torches, bowls of cider, and pieces of bread soaked in cider. They sang to the apple trees, poured cider on their roots, placed bread in their branches, and fired arrows over their tops to scare away evil spirits that might prevent fruiting. Was this ceremony religiously necessary? Of course not. Was it agriculturally effective? Almost certainly not in any scientific sense, but it served important social and psychological functions. It brought the community together in shared ritual. It expressed hope for the future and connection to the land. It acknowledged human dependence on nature's bounty and attempted, however symbolically, to ensure that bounty continued. Medieval people didn't separate practical activity from spiritual activity. Everything was connected. Everything had meaning beyond its surface appearance. Edward participated in the wassailing feeling slightly ridiculous, but also moved by the tradition's ancient roots. These rituals connected him to countless generations of his ancestors who'd performed the same ceremonies, spoken the same words, felt the same mixture of hope and uncertainty about the future. Standing in the torchlit orchard, singing to apple trees while snow drifted down, he felt part of something larger than himself, something that would continue long after he was gone. This feeling of continuity, of being one link in an unbroken chain, was central to medieval consciousness. If you're still with me at this point, thank you so much for listening. Your support means everything to Dreamless Timelines. If you haven't already, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of medieval Christmas surprises you most? Let me know. January 5th, the day before Epiphany, was Preparation Day. The Epiphany feast would be the final grand celebration of the Christmas season, marking the arrival of the wise men at Bethlehem and the revelation of Christ to the Gentile world. Everything had to be perfect for this culmination of 12 days of celebration. The kitchens buzzed with activity again as cooks prepared the final feast. The great hall was cleaned and redecorated. Costumes were prepared for the evening's entertainment. One Epiphany tradition involved baking a special cake with a dried bean hidden inside. Whoever found the bean in their slice became king or queen of the feast, gaining temporary authority to command entertainments and games. This was another example of social inversion, of allowing brief role reversals that reinforced normal hierarchy by providing safety valve release. A servant who found the bean might order nobles to dance or sing, to perform tasks usually beneath their dignity. But tomorrow, normal order would reassert itself, and everyone would return to their proper places. Catherine helped prepare the Epiphany cake under old Margaret's supervision. The cake itself was a rich fruit cake, dense with dried apples and pears, sweetened with honey, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg. Margaret told Catherine stories as they worked, tales about Epiphany celebrations she'd witnessed over her long life. There was the year a pig got into the great hall during the feast and caused chaos, knocking over tables and stealing food while everyone tried to catch it. There was the year traveling acrobats performed stunts so dangerous that Lady Elena had covered her eyes and prayed they wouldn't die in her hall. There was the year Lord William's father had found the bean and commanded everyone to speak only in rhyme for the rest of the evening, creating hilarious linguistic chaos. These stories made Catherine realize how much history the manor contained, how many lives had unfolded within these walls over centuries. The manor itself was over 200 years old, built during the reign of Henry II, and it would likely stand for centuries more. She was just one brief moment in its long existence, a single person passing through on the way to death and whatever came after. The thought should have been depressing, but somehow it wasn't. There was comfort in knowing you were part of something larger, something that would continue. That evening, as darkness fell, Catherine stood at a window looking out over the snow-covered estate. Smoke rose from the village cottages scattered across the manor's lands, marking where families gathered around their own hearths. She wondered about their lives, their hopes and fears, their private joys and sorrows. Did they think about the meaning of their existence? Did they wonder why they were born into their particular circumstances rather than others? Or did they simply live, day following day, accepting what came without questioning? Father Benedict found her there, lost in thought. He'd come to appreciate Catherine's intellectual curiosity, her genuine desire to understand rather than simply accept. They talked as darkness deepened, discussing theology and philosophy in ways Catherine could never discuss with her family. Father Benedict told her about the debates happening at universities like Oxford and Paris, where scholars argued about the nature of reality, the existence of universal forms, the relationship between faith and reason. He spoke about thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who died 76 years earlier but whose ideas still dominated Catholic theology, and William of Ockham, whose nominalist philosophy challenged traditional metaphysics. Catherine absorbed this information hungrily. Women weren't allowed at universities, weren't officially encouraged to pursue serious learning, but her intelligence demanded exercise. She asked Father Benedict about the problem of evil, about how an all-powerful, all-good God could allow suffering. He gave her the standard theological answers: human free will, original sin, the limitations of mortal understanding. But he also admitted these answers didn't fully satisfy him either. Some questions, he said, might not have answers accessible to human reason. Faith meant trusting despite not understanding, continuing to believe even when belief seemed difficult. Their conversation was interrupted by bells announcing it was time for Compline, the day's final prayers. They joined the household in the chapel for the brief service, singing the ancient hymns that marked the day's end. Catherine loved Compline, loved its mood of peaceful resignation as the day released its grip and night took over. The service included psalms about God's protection during darkness, about entrusting yourself to divine care while sleep rendered you vulnerable. In a world where nighttime brought real danger, fire, thieves, illness, these prayers served psychological as well as spiritual needs. January 6th arrived, Epiphany, the culmination of the Christmas season. The word Epiphany comes from Greek, meaning manifestation or appearing, and it commemorated 3 events: the wise men visiting baby Jesus, Christ's baptism in the Jordan River, and his first miracle at the wedding in Cana. In medieval England, the focus was primarily on the wise men, the 3 kings from the east who'd followed a star to Bethlehem bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These weren't ordinary travelers. They were magi, astrologer priests from Persia or Babylon, learned men who studied the stars and recognized divine messages in celestial movements. The morning began with a solemn high mass, Father Benedict pulling out all the liturgical stops for this final great feast of the season. He wore the finest vestments the chapel possessed, embroidered with gold thread and adorned with jewels donated by Lord William's grandfather decades ago. The altar was dressed in white silk, candles burned everywhere, and incense smoke filled the space with fragrances that transporting the mind beyond mundane reality. The service included a special blessing of chalk, which would then be used to mark the doors of the manor with the initials of the 3 wise men, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, and the year, C+M+B 1351. This marking of doors with blessed chalk was believed to protect the household through the coming year from disease, disaster, and evil spirits. Medieval life was precarious, constantly threatened by forces beyond human control, and people sought protection through any means available. Religious rituals, folk customs, herbal remedies, charms, and amulets all were employed to create zones of safety in a dangerous world. Modern people might view this as superstition, but medieval people saw it as common sense. Why wouldn't you take every precaution available when death could strike without warning? After Mass, the household gathered for the final grand feast of the Christmas season. This meal rivaled Christmas days in its elaboration and abundance. The centerpiece was a roasted swan, a dish reserved for the most special occasions. Swans were royal birds, technically the property of the crown, and serving one required special permission. The swan had been hunted in early December, hung for weeks to tenderize, then roasted and redressed in its own feathers to create a spectacular presentation. It arrived at the high table carried by 6 servants, looking almost alive despite being thoroughly cooked. Alongside the swan came every other delicacy the cooks could produce: venison pastries, roasted peacock, gelid eels, lamprey pie, an enormous sturgeon baked whole, meat tarts filled with spiced pork and currants, almond cakes, fruit compotes, custards flavored with rosewater. The sheer variety was almost overwhelming, dozens of dishes appearing in waves, each one beautifully presented. Medieval nobility ate with their eyes as much as their mouths, and visual impact mattered enormously. Food was arranged to create elaborate patterns and scenes. Sugar was sculpted into castles and ships. Entire mythological tableaus were constructed from edible materials. During the feast, entertainers performed constantly. Jugglers, acrobats, musicians, singers, they took turns providing amusement between courses. Geoffrey the minstrel sang a lengthy ballad about the wise men's journey, embellishing the brief biblical account with elaborate details about their adventures traveling from the east. According to Geoffrey's version, the Magi faced bandits and storms, crossed vast deserts and treacherous mountains, witnessed miracles and confronted demons, all to reach Bethlehem and honor the newborn king. The story took nearly an hour to tell, and people listened raptly, transporting by the music and narrative to distant lands they'd never see. Then came the moment everyone had been anticipating, cutting the Epiphany cake to discover who'd found the hidden bean. Lord William himself cut the cake into pieces, ensuring everyone from highest noble to lowest servant received a slice. Catherine watched nervously as people bit into their portions, wondering who'd find the bean. Would it be one of the nobles, a servant, someone in between? The suspense built as slice after slice was consumed without the bean appearing. Finally, young Nicholas, last year's Lord of Misrule, let out a shout. He'd found the bean. This meant he would serve as Epiphany King, extending his authority another day. The hall erupted in cheers and laughter. Nicholas stood, bowing elaborately in every direction, playing up the moment for all it was worth. His first royal decree was that everyone must exchange seats. Nobles moved to servants' tables, servants moved to nobles' tables, complete reversal of normal order. There was momentary confusion as people relocated, then more laughter as servants awkwardly occupied the high table, while nobles crowded onto benches at the lower tables. This role reversal, as I mentioned earlier, served important social functions. It allowed people to briefly experience life from a different perspective, to see how the other half lived. Nobles got a taste of servants' daily reality, harder benches, crude utensils being served last instead of first. Servants got to feel, even if just for one meal, what it was like to occupy positions of honor and privilege. The reversal couldn't last, obviously. Real social change wasn't happening here. But the temporary inversion created a sense that the existing order, while divinely ordained, was also somewhat arbitrary, could theoretically be different. Edward found himself seated between two stable hands, young men close to his age who normally he'd barely acknowledge. They were uncomfortable at first, unsure how to behave in such close proximity to their lord's son. But Edward put them at ease, asking about their work, their lives, their families. He learned that one had a younger brother who'd recently been apprenticed to a blacksmith in town. The other was hoping to save enough money to marry his sweetheart, a dairy maid who worked at a neighboring manor. These were real people with real dreams, not just anonymous servants who existed to serve his needs. Catherine, seated at the high table for the first time in her life, marveled at the perspective. From here, she could see the entire hall spread before her, every person clearly visible in the firelight and candlelight. She understood suddenly why the high table was elevated. It was about sight lines, about being able to observe everything happening in your domain. Power required vision, the ability to see and be seen, to monitor and be accountable. Even something as simple as table placement carried significance in medieval society. King Nicholas's second decree was that everyone must tell a joke or perform a trick. The hall groaned good-naturedly, but people complied. Some jokes were terrible, producing groans rather than laughs. Some were clever, sparking genuine amusement. A few were so bawdy that Father Benedict covered his ears and looked away. The tricks ranged from simple sleight of hand to impressive displays of physical skill. One servant could bend himself nearly double, touching his head to his ankles. Another could stand on his hands and walk around the hall that way. Catherine found herself genuinely enjoying the performances, appreciating talents she'd never noticed before. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still the celebration continued. People were exhausted but determined to squeeze every last bit of joy from the Christmas season before it ended. Tomorrow, normal life would resume. Fields would need attention even in winter. Animals would need care. Household tasks would reassert their daily rhythm. But tonight, for these final hours, magic still held. The space between years still existed, a liminal time when normal rules didn't quite apply. As full darkness fell, the household processed outdoors for the final ceremony, extinguishing the Yule log. Remember, the log had been burning continuously since before Christmas Day, kept alive with careful tending, never allowed to go completely out. Now, on Epiphany evening, it would be ceremonially extinguished, and a piece would be saved to light next year's log, maintaining the chain of fire across years. Thomas the steward supervised this ritual with the same meticulous care he brought to all his responsibilities. Gathered around the great fireplace, watching flames dance across the log's partially consumed mass, Father Benedict spoke prayers of thanksgiving for the Christmas season's blessings, for food and fellowship, for warmth in winter's cold, for the gift of Christ's incarnation that the season celebrated. Then, using special tools, servants dragged the log from the fire and extinguished it with snow. Steam hissed and billowed as hot wood met cold snow, creating clouds that drifted through the hall like spirits. A significant piece of the log was carefully cut away and wrapped in linen to be preserved until next Christmas. The rest would be ground into powder and mixed into animal feed or spread on fields, transferring the log's sacred power into practical agricultural benefit. Nothing was wasted, everything served multiple purposes, the sacred and mundane constantly intermingling in ways that made perfect sense to medieval people, but might seem strange to modern folks accustomed to rigid separation between religious and secular spheres. With the Yule log extinguished, Christmas was officially over. The 12 days had passed, the celebrations concluded, and tomorrow, January 7th, normal life would resume. People would return to their homes, visitors would depart, servants would take down decorations and begin the work of restoring the manor to its everyday state. The Great Hall would revert to being a functional space rather than a stage for celebration. Life would continue as it always did, following its ancient rhythms of work and rest, feast and fast, birth and death. But before everyone dispersed to bed, Lord William called the household together one final time. He stood before them, looking tired but satisfied, and spoke about what the Christmas celebrations meant to him. He thanked everyone for their contributions to the season's success, the servants who'd worked so hard, the cooks who'd created such magnificent feasts, the entertainers who'd brought joy, Father Benedict who'd led them in worship, his family for being his family. He spoke about community, about how the household was more than just a collection of individuals. They were bound together by ties of mutual obligation and, yes, genuine affection. He acknowledged that life was hard, that the coming year would bring challenges and hardships along with whatever joys it might offer. But they would face these difficulties together, supporting each other as they always had. The Christmas celebrations reminded them of their common humanity, their shared dependence on God's grace, their interconnected fates. Rich or poor, noble or common, everyone needed the same things ultimately: food, shelter, love, meaning, hope that their lives mattered beyond their own brief existence. Edward listened to his father's words with new appreciation. He'd always seen Lord William primarily as his father, a personal relationship rather than a public figure. But watching him address the household, seeing how people responded to his leadership, Edward understood the weight of responsibility his father carried. Being a lord wasn't just about privilege and power. It was about caring for everyone dependent on you, making decisions that affected dozens or hundreds of lives, being worthy of the trust people placed in you. Someday, Edward would inherit this responsibility, and he wondered if he'd be equal to it. Catherine too listened intently, but her thoughts ran in different directions. She'd spent the 12 days of Christmas observing her family and household with new eyes, seeing patterns and dynamics she'd never noticed before. She'd also spent considerable time in prayer and contemplation, trying to discern whether her desire for religious life was genuine calling or merely escape from the marriage and motherhood expected of noblewomen. Father Benedict had advised her to wait, to not make hasty decisions, to continue praying for clarity. But Catherine felt increasingly certain of her path. She wanted to dedicate her life to God, to join a convent where she could study and pray and serve. The speech concluded, and people dispersed to their sleeping quarters throughout the manor. Edward climbed the stairs to his chamber in the manor's east tower, undressed by candlelight, and slipped into bed under heavy wool blankets and fur coverlets. The room was freezing despite a small fire in the hearth, and he could see his breath in the candlelight. He thought about the past 12 days, about everything he'd experienced and learned. The Christmas season had been a bubble outside normal time, but now the bubble had popped, and regular life awaited. He fell asleep thinking about the future, about knighthood and war and responsibilities he wasn't sure he was ready for. Catherine, in her chamber 1 floor below Edward's, knelt before her small private altar for evening prayers. She thanked God for the Christmas season, for family and fellowship, for the gift of faith that gave her life meaning and direction. She prayed for guidance about her future, for courage to follow what she believed was her calling even if it meant disappointing her parents. She prayed for Edward for his safety and success. She prayed for her parents for their health and wisdom. She prayed for the household, for the tenants, for everyone whose lives touched hers. Then she climbed into her own bed, pulled the curtains closed around it for warmth and privacy, and drifted into sleep. Lord William and Lady Elena retired to their chambers last, after ensuring everything was secure and everyone settled. They undressed in comfortable silence, having been married long enough that words weren't always necessary. Elena brushed out her long hair while William checked that the fire was banked properly. They climbed into their enormous bed, a piece of furniture that had served 3 generations of the family and would serve generations more. William took Elena's hand in the darkness, squeezed it gently, and whispered that he loved her. She whispered back that she loved him too, grateful for their partnership, for the life they'd built together despite its difficulties and sorrows. Throughout the manor, fires banked down to coals, candles guttered and went out, people slept. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes drifting down through darkness, covering everything in fresh whiteness. The world was quiet except for wind in the trees and the occasional howl of a wolf in the distant forest. Winter still gripped the land and wouldn't release it for months yet. But Christmas had come and gone, light had entered darkness, and people had celebrated together, creating memories that would sustain them through the hard months ahead. Now, let me tell you about what happened after Christmas, because the story doesn't end on January 7th. The Christmas season's conclusion marked the beginning of a new cycle, a return to ordinary time that was never quite the same after the extraordinary time that had just passed. January 7th dawned cold and grey. People rose reluctantly, knowing work awaited but not quite ready to surrender the holiday's leisure. The great hall looked different in the morning light, stripped of its festive decorations, the evergreen boughs removed, the tables dismantled and stored away. Servants swept the floors thoroughly, gathered the old rushes and herbs, carried them out to be composted or burned. The manor was returning to its workaday state, beauty sacrificed to practicality, celebration giving way to routine. Breakfast was simple, a sharp contrast to the elaborate feasts of the previous days. Porridge, bread, weak ale, basic food that would sustain labor without fanfare or fancy presentation. People ate quickly and quietly, still half asleep, not yet fully transitioned back to normal consciousness. The 12 days had been a dream, and waking from dreams was always disorienting, always carried a faint sense of loss. Visitors who'd stayed for Christmas began departing, riding off through snow toward their own manors and estates. Edward said goodbye to friends he'd hunted and celebrated with, making plans to meet again at tournaments or at court. Each departure felt like a small loss, another thread connecting Christmas to ordinary time being severed. By midday, only the immediate household remained, and the manor felt suddenly larger, emptier, quieter than it had in nearly 2 weeks. Thomas the steward assembled the staff to discuss the coming month's work. Despite winter's grip, there was plenty to do. Buildings needed maintenance, roofs repaired, walls patched, shutters mended. Equipment needed attention, plows inspected, tools sharpened, harnesses checked. Animals required constant care, feeding, watering, mucking out stalls. The winter months were when people caught up on tasks neglected during the busy growing season, when they prepared for spring's urgent labor. Lord William met with his bailiff to discuss the estate's finances and plan the coming year. The harvest had been adequate but not exceptional. Some fields would be left fallow to recover their fertility. Others would be planted with different crops to prevent soil exhaustion. Decisions made now would determine whether next winter brought plenty or scarcity. The bailiff reported on tenants who'd fallen behind on rent, on repairs needed throughout the estate, on opportunities to improve productivity. Medieval estate management was complex, requiring careful balancing of immediate needs against long-term sustainability. Catherine spent the day helping her mother inventory the household stores. They counted barrels of ale, sacks of grain, salted meat, dried fish, preserved vegetables, candles, soap, firewood, and hundreds of other items necessary for running a great household. Everything had to be tracked, rationed carefully to last until spring brought renewed abundance. Elena taught Catherine the mental arithmetic required to project consumption rates, to calculate how much they'd need to buy or trade for, to ensure they didn't run short. This wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential, part of what being a lady meant beyond wearing fine dresses and presiding over feasts. As Catherine counted and recorded, she thought about convent life. Would she find this kind of practical work there, or would her days be purely devoted to prayer and contemplation? She'd heard that nuns managed their own estates, oversaw agricultural production, ran schools and hospitals. Perhaps religious life offered more variety than she'd imagined. She made a mental note to ask Father Benedict about the daily routines in different religious orders, to better understand what life she'd be choosing if she followed her calling. Father Benedict himself was in the chapel, carefully packing away the special vestments and altar cloths used during Christmas. These precious items would be stored until next year, wrapped in linen to protect them from moths and moisture. He moved slowly, deliberately, each action a form of prayer. The chapel felt different today, less charged with supernatural presence, more an ordinary room made of stone and wood. But Father Benedict knew the divine was always present, whether people felt it or not. Christmas's intensity couldn't be sustained year-round. There had to be ordinary time, quiet time, time when faith was maintained through discipline rather than emotion. Edward worked with Sir Robert in the practice yard, resuming combat training after the Christmas break. His muscles had stiffened during 2 weeks of relative inactivity, and the first hour of practice was painful, his body protesting the sudden return to hard physical labor. But gradually he warmed up, found his rhythm, rediscovered the joy he always felt when fighting. The clang of steel on steel, the weight of the sword in his hand, the challenge of reading an opponent's movements and responding appropriately, this was what he was made for, what he trained his whole life to do. Sir Robert pushed him hard, offering no sympathy for holiday laziness. "You think enemies will wait for you to warm up," he growled, launching a series of strikes that Edward barely blocked. "You think they'll care that you feasted too much and need to get back in shape. In battle, you're ready or you're dead, no middle ground." Edward gritted his teeth and fought harder, channeling frustration into focus, accepting the lesson beneath the harsh words. Sir Robert was right. Combat allowed no room for excuses or second chances. The days following Epiphany blurred together, one much like another, the rhythm of winter life reasserting itself. People rose in darkness, worked through short daylight hours, returned to darkness. They huddled around fires, told stories, mended clothes, carved wood, spun wool, ground grain, cooked meals, slept. Life was simpler in winter, reduced to essentials, the frantic pace of spring and summer and autumn giving way to enforced slowness. Some people chafed against winter's confinement, desperate for the freedom and activity of warmer seasons. Others welcomed the rest, the chance to recover from months of exhausting labor. Catherine found herself thinking often about the conversations she'd had with Father Benedict during Christmas. His description of university life had captivated her imagination, scholars debating philosophy and theology, studying ancient texts, pushing the boundaries of human understanding. She wanted to be part of that world of ideas, to contribute to those conversations, to learn everything there was to learn. But women weren't allowed at universities, weren't considered capable of serious intellectual work. The church offered the only path for women seeking education, and even that path was limited. Nuns could read Latin and study scripture, but they weren't writing theological treatises or engaging in formal philosophical debates. One snowy afternoon, Catherine worked up courage to speak with her father about her future. She found Lord William in his private chamber, reviewing accounts by candlelight. He looked up when she entered, smiled, gestured for her to sit. They talked for a while about ordinary things, the weather, the household, plans for spring. Then Catherine took a deep breath and told him about her desire to enter religious life rather than marry. She explained that she'd been praying about this for years, that it wasn't a whim or an attempt to avoid responsibility, that she genuinely felt called to dedicate her life to God. Lord William listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When Catherine finished, he was silent for a long moment, thinking. Finally he spoke, his voice careful, gentle. He said he'd suspected this, had seen her devotion, understood that she was different from other girls her age. He wasn't opposed in principle to her joining a convent, but he asked her to wait, to give the matter more time before making an irrevocable decision. She was young still, only 15. How could she be certain this was truly her calling rather than adolescent idealism that might fade with maturity? He asked her to wait at least a year, to continue praying and discerning, and if she still felt the same in 12 months, they'd discuss it again seriously. Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to insist she was certain now, didn't need more time, but she recognized the wisdom in her father's request and the love behind it. He wasn't refusing her. He was asking her to be sure, to test her conviction against time's passage. She agreed to wait, to continue discerning, though she felt confident her decision wouldn't change. They embraced, and Catherine left feeling both frustrated and grateful. Frustrated by the delay, grateful for a father who listened and tried to understand rather than simply imposing his will. I want to pause here for just a moment and say thank you again for listening to this journey through medieval Christmas. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, please take a second to subscribe to Dreamless Timelines and hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Your support truly matters. All right, let's continue with our story. Late January brought a severe cold snap, temperatures plummeting far below freezing, snow falling almost continuously for a week. The manor became essentially isolated, the roads impassable even on horseback. This was the hardest part of winter, when supplies ran lowest, when cabin fever set in, when people wondered if spring would ever come. Illnesses spread through the crowded household, coughs, fevers, the flux that left people weak and dehydrated. Old Margaret brewed medicinal teas, applied poultices, muttered prayers and charms over the sick. Some recovered, some worsened. 2 elderly servants died within days of each other, their bodies stored in a barn until the ground thawed enough for burial. Death was such a constant presence in medieval life that people developed elaborate rituals for dealing with it. The bodies were washed and wrapped in linen shrouds, laid out in the chapel where household members could pay respects. Father Benedict led prayers, commending the souls to God's mercy, asking forgiveness for their sins, expressing hope for their resurrection on Judgment Day. Everyone understood they'd follow soon enough. Death came for everyone, rich or poor, young or old, saintly or sinful. The only questions were when and how, not whether. Edward helped dig grave in the frozen ground, exhausting work that took hours of hacking through ice-hard earth. He'd never done such labor before. Grave digging was servant's work, but he volunteered because it seemed right, seemed like honoring people who'd served his family faithfully. Sir Robert worked beside him without comment, and together they created 2 holes deep enough to receive the bodies. The funeral was simple, brief, conducted in bitter cold that made everyone anxious to finish and return indoors. The bodies were lowered, earth was shoveled back in, and that was that. 2 lives ended, barely noted except by those who'd known them personally. The experience affected Edward deeply. He'd seen death before, had hunted animals, had heard stories of battle, but this was different. These were people he'd known, had eaten meals with, had exchanged greetings with daily. Now they were gone, reduced to wrapped bundles in cold ground, their entire existence summarized by a few words Father Benedict spoke over their grave. What did their lives mean? What had they accomplished? They'd worked hard, served faithfully, and died in winter's grip. Was that enough? Was any life enough? He discussed these thoughts with Sir Robert that evening, and the old knight listened patiently before responding. Every life matters, Sir Robert said finally, not because of what's accomplished or achieved, but because every person is God's creation, made in the divine image, loved by their Creator. Those servants lived lives of service and dignity. They fed people, kept the manor running, did their work well. That's honorable. Don't measure life by wealth or fame or power. Measure it by faithfulness to your responsibilities and kindness to others. February arrived with little fanfare, winter's dead heart, the month when nothing grew and everyone just endured. People stayed indoors as much as possible, conserving energy, rationing supplies, counting down days until Lent would begin and then Easter would arrive and then finally spring would return. The days were lengthening noticeably now, daylight lasting a bit longer each day, though it would be months before that extra light translated into warmth or growth. Candlemas, February 2nd, brought a small celebration. An echo of Christmas's brightness in winter's darkness. The feast commemorated the presentation of Jesus at the temple 40 days after his birth, when Mary's purification period ended according to Jewish law. All the candles that would be used in the church throughout the coming year were blessed on Candlemas, hence the name. The ceremony was beautiful, the chapel filled with hundreds of candles, creating a sea of flickering light that pushed back the darkness. That promised light would eventually triumph over winter's gloom. Catherine loved Candlemas, loved the symbolism of light persisting through darkness, loved the reminder that hope remained even in winter's depths. She watched the candles burning and thought about her own life, her own future. The conversation with her father had gone better than she'd feared. He hadn't refused her desire for religious life, hadn't ordered her to marry against her will. He'd asked for patience, for time to be certain. She could do that. She would spend the coming year deepening her spiritual life, preparing herself for what she believed was her calling. The weeks after Candlemas dragged by slowly, each day much like the last. People worked, ate, slept, survived. There were small dramas, a dispute between servants that Thomas had to mediate, a store of grain discovered to be infested with weevils, requiring disposal of contaminated supplies, a horse that fell ill and had to be carefully nursed back to health. These events broke the monotony but didn't fundamentally change life's basic rhythm. Edward continued his martial training obsessively, using physical exhaustion to quiet his mind. He practiced sword work until his arms trembled with fatigue, rode midnight through snow until both horse and rider were soaked with sweat despite the cold, studied tactics and strategy with Sir Robert by firelight. He was preparing for war, though no war was immediately imminent. The 100 Years' War with France continued, of course, but the fighting had settled into a pattern of raids and skirmishes rather than major battles. Still, Edward would go to war eventually. It was his destiny, his purpose, the reason for his entire education and training. Lady Alina spent February supervising the household's women in their endless textile work. Wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, woven into cloth, cut and sewn into clothes. This process employed dozens of women and girls from throughout the estate, turning raw sheep's wool into finished garments that would clothe the household. Alina was an expert in every stage of production, able to judge wool quality by touch, assess thread tension, evaluate weaving consistency. She'd learned these skills from her own mother and would pass them to Catherine, whether Catherine wanted them or not. The relationship between Alina and Catherine was complicated that winter. Alina knew about Catherine's desire for religious life, Lord William had told her, and she didn't know how to feel about it. Part of her was proud that Catherine wanted to dedicate her life to God. Part of her was disappointed that Catherine wouldn't give her grandchildren, wouldn't continue the family line. Part of her worried that Catherine was making a mistake, choosing cloistered life out of fear of the world rather than genuine calling. But she kept these thoughts to herself, allowing Catherine space to discern her path. One evening in late February, a travelling merchant arrived at the manor seeking shelter. His name was Gilbert, and he'd been travelling from London to York when his wagon broke an axle, stranding him miles from anywhere. He'd abandoned the wagon, loaded what goods he could carry on his pack horses, and made his way to Thornbury Manor hoping for hospitality. Lord William offered it gladly, as was customary. Travellers brought news from the wider world, stories from distant places, goods not available locally. Gilbert was welcomed as an honoured guest, given a place at the high table, and encouraged to share his news. Over dinner, Gilbert told stories about London, about the court, about political intrigues and scandals that fascinated the isolated household. King Edward III was old now, Gilbert said, his health failing, his power waning. His son, the Black Prince, had been ill for years and couldn't rule. Real power was held by various factions competing for influence, preparing for the succession that would come when Edward III finally died. The political situation was unstable, potentially dangerous, and smart people were positioning themselves for whatever came next. Gilbert also brought religious news. There was a growing movement in England questioning certain church practices and doctrines. A scholar at Oxford named John Wycliffe was translating the Bible into English, arguing that ordinary people should be able to read scripture in their own language, rather than depending on Latin translations they couldn't understand. The church hierarchy opposed this vehemently, claiming it threatened proper interpretation and church authority. But Wycliffe had powerful supporters, and his ideas were spreading despite official condemnation. Father Benedict listened to this news with mixed feelings. Intellectually, he appreciated the argument for vernacular scripture. Why shouldn't people read God's word in their own language? But he also understood the church's concerns. Without proper guidance, people might misinterpret scripture, develop heretical ideas, challenge legitimate authority. The issue was complex, not easily resolved, and Father Benedict was grateful he didn't have to make decisions about it. He could just think and pray and discuss, without bearing responsibility for outcomes. Gilbert stayed several days, waiting for the weather to clear enough for him to continue his journey. During that time, he showed the household his merchandise: spices from the East, fine cloth from Flanders, tools forged in German workshops, books copied by French monks. These goods represented the vast trading networks that connected medieval Europe to Asia and Africa, networks that brought luxury items to the wealthy while making fortunes for successful merchants. Gilbert was prosperous, that was obvious from his clothes and bearing, but he'd started as a peasant's son with nothing but ambition and luck. Catherine spent time talking with Gilbert about his travels, hungry for descriptions of places she'd never seen. He'd been to Paris, to Venice, to Constantinople itself. He'd crossed the Alps on muleback, survived storms at sea, negotiated with Muslim traders, witnessed executions and miracles. His life was everything Catherine's was not: free, adventurous, constantly changing. She envied him despite herself, despite her desire for contemplative stability. There was a part of her that wanted to see the world, experience everything, before settling into religious life's restrictions. One night, Gilbert and Father Benedict stayed up late discussing theology and philosophy. Gilbert had little formal education, but he traveled widely and absorbed ideas from many cultures. He asked questions that challenged Father Benedict's assumptions, pointed out inconsistencies in church teachings, raised doubts about doctrines Benedict had accepted without question. It was exhilarating and uncomfortable, this conversation that ranged from predestination to free will to the nature of the Trinity to whether animals had souls. Benedict found himself defending positions he wasn't entirely sure he believed, realizing how much of his faith rested on authority rather than personal conviction. When Gilbert finally departed, the manor felt quieter, smaller, duller. He'd brought a taste of the wider world, reminded people that their isolated existence was part of something larger. His absence left a vacuum, a renewed sense of confinement. Winter still held the land in its grip, and spring seemed impossibly distant despite the lengthening days. Now let me tell you about Lent, because this is where medieval Christianity really showed its intense, demanding character. Lent began on Ash Wednesday, 40 days before Easter, and it was a period of serious fasting and penance. Not the gentle, give-up chocolate version modern folks practice, but real, physically demanding deprivation. For the entire 40 days of Lent, medieval Christians ate only one full meal per day, taken in the evening. No meat, no dairy, no eggs. No fat for cooking, just fish, vegetables, bread, and water. The wealthy could afford expensive fish and elaborate vegetable dishes, but common people basically survived on pottage and dark bread. The point wasn't just physical hardship, though that was part of it. The point was spiritual discipline, training the will to resist temptation, identifying with Christ's suffering, preparing for Easter's joy through shared deprivation. Medieval people took Lent seriously, attending special services, increasing their prayer time, examining their consciences, confessing sins. It was a collective spiritual boot camp, and everyone participated whether they wanted to or not. Ash Wednesday arrived in early March, and Father Benedict conducted the ceremony marking Lent's beginning. Each person in the household came forward to receive ashes on their forehead, ashes mixed from burned palm branches from the previous year's Palm Sunday. Father Benedict made the sign of the cross in ash on each forehead while intoning the traditional words, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." It was stark, uncompromising, a reminder that life was brief and death inevitable, and God's judgment awaited everyone. Catherine received her ashes, feeling them gritty on her skin, and returned to her place feeling shaken. Death, dust, judgment, these weren't abstract concepts. They were reality, the ultimate destiny awaiting her and everyone she loved. What happened after death? Heaven or hell or purgatory? How could you know if you were saved? The uncertainty terrified her, drove her to prayer with renewed urgency. The Lenten fast began immediately, and the household's meals changed dramatically. Breakfast disappeared entirely. The midday meal was reduced to bread and ale. Only the evening meal provided substantial nutrition, and even that was limited to permitted foods. People went hungry constantly, their stomachs growling, their bodies craving the meat and dairy they'd consumed freely just days earlier. The wealthy could afford variety within the restrictions: expensive fish, imported fruits, elaborate vegetable preparations. The poor ate pottage flavored with herbs, bread made from whatever grain was available, small beer that provided calories along with hydration. Edward found the Lenten fast difficult. His active lifestyle required substantial nutrition, and training while hungry was challenging. Sir Robert showed no sympathy, insisting that learning to fight while hungry was valuable practice. In real combat, Edward might go days without proper food. He needed to learn how his body performed under those conditions, needed to push through weakness and maintain effectiveness despite physical deprivation. So Edward trained hard, endured hunger, and tried to see it as part of his education. The long evenings of Lent were spent in extended prayer and scripture reading. Father Benedict led the household through gospel readings each night, explaining the passages, drawing moral lessons, encouraging spiritual reflection. He was a gifted speaker when engaged with material he cared about, and these evening sessions revealed his passion for scripture and theology. Catherine absorbed everything, asking questions, challenging interpretations, demonstrating the sharp intellect that made Father Benedict certain she was called to religious life. Lady Alina observed her daughter's spiritual intensity with concern. Catherine's faith seemed to be deepening beyond normal piety into something more extreme, more demanding. She prayed for hours, fasted beyond what was required, performed small penances that seemed unnecessary. Alina worried that Catherine was too hard on herself, too focused on unworthiness and sin, not giving herself credit for genuine virtue. But when Alina tried to discuss this, Catherine deflected, insisting she was fine, just trying to be a faithful Christian. Mid-March brought the Feast of the Annunciation, March 25th, exactly 9 months before Christmas. This feast commemorated the angel Gabriel's announcement to Mary that she would bear God's Son, the moment when human and divine intersected to begin the story of salvation. It was a joyful break in Lent's severity, a day when fasting rules relaxed slightly and people could celebrate. The liturgy was elaborate, focusing on Mary's faith and obedience, her willingness to accept God's plan despite not fully understanding it. Catherine meditated on the Annunciation intensely. Mary had been about her age, maybe even younger, when the angel appeared. Mary had been asked to trust completely, to surrender control of her life, to accept a destiny she hadn't chosen. And Mary had said, "Yes, let it be done to me according to your word." That phrase echoed in Catherine's mind. Could she say yes like that? Could she surrender so completely? She wanted to believe she could, but doubt gnawed at her. What if she was wrong about her calling? What if she entered a convent and discovered she'd made a terrible mistake? These doubts troubled Catherine through the remaining weeks of Lent. She prayed for certainty, for unmistakable confirmation that religious life was truly God's will for her. But no angelic visitor appeared. No divine voice spoke from heaven. There was only silence and her own thoughts, which seemed inadequate guides for such a momentous decision. Still, she continued praying, continued preparing herself mentally and spiritually for the life she believed awaited her. Late March brought the first genuine signs of spring. Snow melted, revealing brown earth beneath. Birds returned from wherever they'd spent the winter, filling dawn with song. Tiny green shoots appeared in the manor's kitchen garden, promising vegetables in months to come. The ice on the manor's pond cracked and broke apart, allowing ducks to paddle across open water. These changes were subtle at first, but accelerated daily as the season turned. People emerged from winter's confinement, blinking in stronger sunlight, grateful to have survived another cold season. Work intensified as spring arrived. Fields needed plowing before planting could begin. Animals needed to be moved from winter shelters to pastures. Equipment needed repair after months of storage. Everyone worked from dawn to dusk, racing to complete tasks before the brief planting window closed. Spring in medieval agriculture was frantic, all-consuming, leaving no time for rest or contemplation. You planted when the weather permitted, or you didn't plant at all, and not planting meant starvation next winter. Edward joined the field work despite his noble status. It wasn't required, but he felt drawn to participate, to understand the agricultural labor that made his life possible. He helped guide the plow behind the ox team, feeling the resistance as the blade cut through compacted soil. He broadcast seed across plowed fields, handfuls of grain flung in arcing patterns that would, God willing, produce hundredfold returns. He weeded garden beds on his knees, pulling up unwanted plants competing with desired crops. The work was backbreaking, mind-numbing, relentless, but it was also honest, productive, connected to the most fundamental human need, food. Sir Robert watched Edward's agricultural efforts with amusement, but didn't discourage them. A knight should understand all aspects of his domain, he told Edward one evening. You can't lead people if you don't understand their lives, their challenges, their labor. Besides, physical work builds character and strength. A soft lord makes a poor leader. Edward appreciated the approval, even as his body protested muscles being used in unfamiliar ways. Palm Sunday arrived, the Sunday before Easter, marking the beginning of Holy Week. This was Christianity's most sacred period, commemorating the final days of Christ's life, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, his last supper with disciples, his betrayal and arrest, his trial and crucifixion, his death and burial, and finally his resurrection. Each day had its own rituals, its own liturgies, its own emotional tone. The week was a journey through despair to hope, through death to life, through darkness to light. The Palm Sunday ceremony began with a procession around the manor grounds, everyone carrying branches, not palm branches which didn't grow in England, but willow branches that substituted adequately. They sang hymns praising Christ as they walked, recreating the crowd's welcome when Jesus entered Jerusalem riding a donkey. The contrast between this joyful beginning and the week's coming sorrow was intentional, emphasizing how quickly human emotions and commitments could shift. The crowd that praised Jesus on Sunday would call for his crucifixion by Friday. Father Benedict preached about betrayal, about how Peter denied Christ 3 times, how Judas sold him for 30 pieces of silver, how all the disciples abandoned him when danger came. These weren't stories about distant historical figures. They were mirrors held up to examine personal failures. Every person had betrayed someone, denied uncomfortable truths, abandoned principles when maintaining them became difficult. Recognizing this shared guilt was essential to understanding Christ's sacrifice. He died for everyone's sins, not just spectacular crimes, but ordinary failures, daily betrayals, small cowardices that accumulated into mountains of wrongdoing. The sermon moved Catherine to tears, not sad tears, but tears of recognition and relief. She saw herself in the disciples' failures, saw her own weakness and uncertainty reflected in their behavior. But she also saw that failure wasn't final, that betrayal could be forgiven, that Christ's love persisted despite human unworthiness. Peter had denied Jesus, but later became the church's foundation. Judas despaired and killed himself, but the other disciples received forgiveness and went on to spread Christianity throughout the known world. The difference wasn't in the severity of their sins, but in their response afterward. Peter accepted forgiveness, Judas rejected it. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of Holy Week passed in relative quiet, building tension toward the week's climax. People attended special services morning and evening, but during the day they worked normally, completing urgent spring tasks that couldn't wait. The juxtaposition was strange, sacred time and ordinary time overlapping, people praying intensely while also worrying about crops and weather, and all the mundane concerns that never disappeared. Maundy Thursday commemorated the Last Supper, when Christ washed his disciples' feet and instituted the Eucharist. Lord William participated in a foot-washing ceremony, kneeling before 12 of his poorest tenants and washing their feet in imitation of Christ's humility. This was a powerful reversal of normal social hierarchy, the Lord serving those who normally served him. The tenants were uncomfortable, unused to such attention from their social superior. But Lord William performed the ritual seriously, treating each person with dignity, demonstrating that Christian faith required humility from everyone regardless of status. After the foot washing, the household gathered for a special meal commemorating the Last Supper. Despite Lenten restrictions, this meal included wine blessed by Father Benedict, who spoke the words of consecration that transformed it into Christ's blood. Everyone drank from the communal cup, literally sharing the same substance, their bodies incorporating the divine. The symbolism was profound. Just as bread and wine became Christ's body and blood, Christians' bodies became temples of the Holy Spirit. The boundary between material and spiritual, between human and divine, blurred and dissolved. That night, Father Benedict led an all-night prayer vigil in the chapel, keeping watch as Christ had asked his disciples to do in Gethsemane. Catherine attended the entire vigil, kneeling on cold stone, praying through exhaustion and discomfort. Her knees ached, her back cramped, her mind wandered despite efforts to stay focused. But she persisted, seeing the physical suffering as a tiny echo of what Christ had endured. Compared to crucifixion, what were sore knees and a tired body? The hours passed slowly, marked by prayers and hymns, until finally dawn broke and Good Friday arrived. Good Friday, the name was ironic. There was nothing good about this day that commemorated Christ's execution. But good in this context meant holy, set apart, significant beyond measure. Good Friday was the day God died, the day heaven wept, the day creation itself groaned with anguish. Medieval people observed Good Friday with utmost solemnity. No work was done except absolute necessities. No meat was cooked or eaten. People attended church services lasting hours, listening to the Passion narrative read in full, contemplating the mystery of divine suffering. The afternoon service, held at the hour Christ died, was the year's most solemn liturgy. The chapel was stripped bare, all decorations removed, the altar covered with black cloth. Father Benedict entered wearing black vestments and prostrated himself before the altar, lying face down on the stone floor. The congregation knelt in silence, the weight of the moment almost unbearable. Then Father Benedict rose and chanted the Passion according to John, his voice filling the chapel with the story of betrayal, arrest, trial, and execution. Edward listened to the familiar story and heard it differently this time. Christ before Pilate, refusing to save himself, accepting unjust condemnation. This was courage of a kind Edward had never considered. Military courage, battlefield bravery, these he understood and aspired to. But this was different. This was choosing suffering when you could avoid it, accepting death when you could escape, trusting God's plan when it made no human sense. Could he do that? Face death not fighting but submitting, not resisting but accepting. The question unsettled him. The service concluded with the veneration of the cross, each person approaching to kiss a wooden crucifix held by Father Benedict. This wasn't the decorated crosses seen in churches today, adorned with gems and precious metals. This was rough wood, the instrument of execution, a reminder that Christ's death was violent, degrading, excruciatingly painful. Catherine kissed the cross and tasted salt from tears she hadn't realized she was crying. Alina kissed it and thought about her dead children, wondering if Christ's mother Mary had felt anything like her own grief. Edward kissed it and silently promised to live worthy of such sacrifice, though he had no idea what that promise really meant. The rest of Good Friday passed in near total silence. People spoke in whispers if they spoke at all. Even children were subdued, sensing the day's extraordinary gravity. Meals were minimal: bread, water, maybe some vegetables. The day felt endless, time moving slowly as if reluctant to progress toward whatever came next. People waited in grief and confusion, knowing intellectually that Easter was coming, but unable to feel hope through present sorrow's weight. Holy Saturday was even stranger, a day suspended between death and resurrection, between despair and hope, between ending and beginning. Medieval theology taught that on this day, Christ descended to hell, not to suffer but to free the souls trapped there, to extend salvation to everyone who died before his incarnation. The idea was wild, God invading death's realm, shattering its gates, releasing prisoners. Death itself died on Holy Saturday, its power broken even before Christ's physical resurrection. The day passed in quiet preparation for Easter. The chapel was cleaned and redecorated. The altar cloth was changed from black to white. Flowers gathered from the manor's grounds were arranged in vases. Candles were placed everywhere. Food was prepared for tomorrow's feast: roasted lamb, the first meat in weeks, along with eggs and cheese and all the foods forbidden during Lent. People worked mechanically, still processing Good Friday's emotional intensity, not yet ready to embrace joy, but moving toward it gradually. As night fell, the Easter Vigil began, the year's most important service. The chapel was completely dark, all candles extinguished, symbolizing the darkness of Christ's tomb. The household gathered in that darkness, waiting. Then Father Benedict entered carrying a single candle, the Paschal candle representing Christ as light of the world. Lumen Christi, he chanted, light of Christ. The flame from his candle spread to other candles, person to person, until the entire chapel blazed with light. Darkness had been defeated, light had returned, Christ had risen. The Exsultet, the ancient Easter proclamation, filled the chapel with exuberant joy. Rejoice, heavenly powers, sing, choirs of angels, exult all creation, Christ has conquered, glory fills you, darkness vanishes forever. The words were Latin, but their meaning transcended language. This was victory, triumph, everything transformed. Death, the ultimate enemy, had been conquered. Salvation was possible, hope had returned. Catherine felt something shift inside her during the Exsultet, something she couldn't quite name. For months she'd been wrestling with doubt and uncertainty about her calling. But in that moment, listening to the proclamation of resurrection, she felt peace. She didn't have all the answers. She couldn't predict the future. But she knew with sudden certainty that she was supposed to follow the path toward religious life. God would provide clarity about specific details. For now, she just needed to trust and take the next step. The vigil continued with multiple readings from Scripture, tracing salvation history from creation through the patriarchs through the prophets to Christ. Then came the baptism of new Christians, this year, 2 infants and 1 adult convert. The Barbies were dunked completely in the baptismal font, emerging sputtering and crying, symbolically drowned to their old life and raised to new life in Christ. The adult, a former pagan from a distant village, was submerged 3 times and emerged beaming, welcomed into the Christian community with joy and celebration. Finally, at midnight, the Mass of Easter began. This was the year's peak, its climax, the moment everything pointed toward. Christ had risen, death was defeated, life had conquered. The readings were short, the women finding the empty tomb, the angels announcing resurrection, the disciples' initial disbelief giving way to joy. Then came the Eucharist, the consecration of bread and wine, the sharing of Christ's body and blood with everyone present. Edward received communion and felt, for perhaps the first time in his life, that he truly understood what he was doing. This wasn't just ritual or tradition. This was participating in mystery, incorporating the divine, being transformed from within. He'd been baptized as an infant and received communion hundreds of times since, but it had been automatic, unreflective. Now he grasped, however imperfectly, that this simple act of eating bread and drinking wine connected him to Christ, to every Christian throughout history, to the eternal reality beyond time and space. If you're still awake, or if you're in that wonderful space between waking and sleeping, I want to thank you for staying with this journey. Stories like these take time to tell properly, and your patience means the world. If you find value in these historical deep dives, please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines and let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like explored. Your engagement helps this channel grow. Now, let's continue toward the end of our story. The Easter Mass concluded and the household emerged from the chapel into pre-dawn darkness. But the world felt different, charged with possibility. Easter had come, Christ had risen. Winter was definitively over, spring was here, and life would continue. People dispersed to get a few hours of sleep before the Easter feast, but they were too excited to rest much. After weeks of fasting and deprivation, after the intensity of Holy Week, they were ready to celebrate. Easter morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made everything seem possible. Birds sang enthusiastically, as if they too were celebrating resurrection. Wildflowers dotted the meadows around the manor, primrose, violet, wood anemone, splashes of color after winter's monochrome. The air smelled of growing things, of earth warming, of life returning. People dressed in their finest clothes, the same garments worn for Christmas, but now feeling fresh and appropriate for a different kind of celebration. The Easter feast rivaled Christmas in its elaboration, but differed in tone. Christmas celebrated incarnation, God becoming human, entering creation's mess and limitation. Easter celebrated liberation, Christ conquering death, opening the way to eternal life. Both were joyful, but Easter's joy had an edge of triumph, a victory snatched from apparent defeat. The menu reflected this, roasted lamb as the centerpiece, symbolizing Christ as sacrificial lamb, surrounded by spring vegetables, fresh bread, the first soft cheeses after weeks without dairy, and eggs dyed bright colors representing new life. The eggs were particularly significant in medieval Easter celebration. During Lent, chickens continued laying, but people couldn't eat the eggs, so they accumulated in enormous quantities. On Easter, this backlog was finally consumed in every imaginable preparation: boiled, fried, baked into custards, incorporated into cakes and tarts. Children engaged in egg-rolling contests, racing decorated eggs down gentle slopes to see who's traveled farthest without breaking. Adults played egg-tapping games, competitors striking their eggs together until one cracked, the victor claiming both eggs. Edward participated in the egg games with enthusiasm, finding unexpected joy in such simple competition. After months of serious martial training, after Holy Week's emotional intensity, this playful activity felt liberating. He laughed harder than he had in weeks, trash-talked his opponents good-naturedly, celebrated victories and accepted defeats with equal grace. This, he thought, was what Easter meant, not just theological abstraction about resurrection, but concrete experience of joy returning after sorrow, life continuing after what seemed like death. Catherine watched her brother's playfulness with affection. Edward was changing, growing from the boy she'd known into the man he was becoming. The process wasn't smooth or simple, but it was happening nonetheless. She wondered what kind of lord he'd be someday, what kind of husband and father. She hoped he'd retain this capacity for joy, this ability to be fully present in the moment. So many adults lost that, became weighed down by responsibility and worry, forgot how to play. The Easter feast lasted for hours, course following course in the now familiar pattern. Entertainment between courses included music, dancing, storytelling, and a special performance by traveling players who'd arrived Easter morning. They performed a resurrection play. A dramatic representation of the biblical accounts, with elaborations that made the story accessible and emotionally powerful. The actor playing Mary Magdalene at the tomb was particularly affecting, his performance conveying her grief, confusion, and ultimate joy so vividly that people wept watching him. As afternoon stretched toward evening, games and competitions continued in the manor's courtyard. Archery contests, wrestling matches, foot races, everyone participated according to their abilities. Even elderly servants joined in, competing in less physically demanding events like storytelling contests and riddle competitions. The point wasn't winning but participating, celebrating community and life together. Medieval Easter was fundamentally communal, about the body of believers rather than individual salvation, about collective joy rather than private mystical experience. Old Margaret improbably won the storytelling contest with a tale so outrageous, so full of impossible events and absurd coincidences that people were crying with laughter by the end. It involved a knight, 3 dragons, a magical fish, a talking horse, a beautiful princess, and a series of misunderstandings that somehow resulted in everyone living happily ever after. The story made no sense, violated every law of probability and nature, but it was told with such conviction and enthusiasm that none of that mattered. People needed nonsense sometimes, needed escape from reality's harshness into pure fantasy. As darkness fell, the household gathered one final time for Easter evening prayers. Father Benedict spoke briefly about the significance of the day, about what resurrection meant not just for Christ, but for everyone who believed. Death wasn't the end, he reminded them. This life wasn't all there was. The body would die, yes, but the soul continued, and on Judgment Day even the body would be resurrected, restored, perfected. They would see their loved ones again. They would live in God's presence forever. This was Christianity's core promise, its fundamental hope. Catherine listened and felt the truth of these words not as intellectual proposition, but as deep certainty. She would see her dead siblings again. Death was real but temporary. Loss was painful but not permanent. This belief made the present bearable, gave meaning to suffering, provided hope that sustained people through unimaginable hardships. Without it, medieval life would have been nearly unbearable. So much death, so much pain, so little control over circumstances. But with it, everything changed. Pain had meaning. Death had no final victory. Love persisted beyond the grave. The days following Easter were called Easter Week, a continued celebration though less intense than Easter Day itself. People returned to normal work rhythms but maintained a festive atmosphere. Visitors came and went, sharing news, renewing social connections, conducting business that had been postponed during Lent and Holy Week. The manor felt alive with activity and possibility, everyone energized by spring's arrival and Easter's promise. Lord William used this period to meet with his tenants, discussing plans for the coming agricultural season. Which fields would be planted with what crops, which areas would be left fallow, how labor would be allocated, who owed what in rent and services. Medieval agriculture was collaborative by necessity, requiring coordination among dozens of families working interdependent plots. The Lord couldn't simply dictate terms. He had to negotiate, consider everyone's needs and constraints, balance competing demands. Good lordship required political skill as much as military prowess. Edward attended these meetings, learning the less glamorous aspects of noble responsibility. Military training was exciting, tournament combat was glorious, but estate management was where lords succeeded or failed. A knight who couldn't manage his lands effectively would lose them, no matter how skilled at arms. So Edward listened as his father and the tenants discussed crop rotation and animal husbandry, drainage projects and boundary disputes. He tried to remember the lessons, knowing he'd need this knowledge someday. Lady Alina spent Easter week organizing the household's transition to summer schedules. During winter, everyone lived crowded together for warmth and safety. But with mild weather, some activities could move outdoors. The kitchens could use outdoor ovens, reducing heat inside the manor. Textile work could happen in the courtyard where light was better. Animals could graze freely rather than being stabled constantly. The entire rhythm of daily life shifted with the seasons, and managing these transitions required careful planning. Catherine helped her mother with this work, but her mind was elsewhere. The clarity she'd felt during the Easter vigil remained, strengthening her conviction about religious life. She wanted to discuss this with her father again, to remind him of their conversation and confirm that the promised year of discernment was passing. But something held her back, some instinct that the timing wasn't quite right yet. So she waited, trusting that the opportunity would present itself when appropriate. Late April brought more visitors, Lord William's brother Thomas and his family, travelling from their estate 3 days' ride away. Uncle Thomas was a cheerful man, loud and gregarious, who seemed to fill whatever space he occupied with energy and noise. His wife Margaret was quieter, more reserved, but with a sharp wit that emerged in unexpected moments. They had 3 children, 2 sons older than Edward and a daughter younger than Catherine, and the manor suddenly felt crowded with young people. The older cousins, Richard and Henry, were already knights, having completed their training and participated in campaigns in France. They regaled Edward with war stories, describing battles and sieges, the chaos and terror and occasional glory of medieval warfare. Their accounts were less romantic than the minstrels' songs, more honest about war's ugliness and randomness. Men died from disease as often as enemy action. Sieges were boring, months of sitting outside walls waiting for defenders to starve or surrender. Battle itself was brief but terrifying, and survival often depended more on luck than skill. Edward absorbed these stories eagerly, asking questions about tactics and equipment, trying to learn everything he could before his own military service began. Richard and Henry were patient teachers, understanding Edward's eagerness because they'd felt the same at his age. They warned him not to romanticize war, but they also acknowledged its necessity. England's honor and interests required military power. Knights existed to provide that power. It was an honorable calling, even if the reality was less glorious than the ideal. The younger cousin Alice attached herself to Catherine, following her everywhere, peppering her with questions about life at Thornbury Manor. Alice was 13, exactly the age when girls became fascinated by their older female relatives, seeing them as models for their own approaching adulthood. Catherine found Alice's attention simultaneously flattering and annoying. She didn't feel qualified to offer guidance about life. She was still figuring things out herself, but Alice expected wisdom and insight, so Catherine tried to provide it. They spent hours walking the manor's grounds, talking about everything and nothing. Catherine found herself discussing her religious vocation, something she hadn't really talked about with anyone except Father Benedict and her parents. Alice listened wide-eyed, fascinated by the idea of convent life but also slightly horrified. "You mean you'd never marry, never have children, just pray all day forever?" Catherine tried to explain that religious life wasn't privation but fulfillment, not sacrifice, but choosing what you truly wanted. But she could see Alice didn't really understand, couldn't imagine wanting anything besides the conventional path of marriage and motherhood. The conversation troubled Catherine because it made her articulate things she'd only vaguely felt. Why did she want religious life? What attracted her to it? Was it genuine calling or fear of alternatives? She told Alice about her love of learning, her desire to study scripture and theology, her sense that God wanted something specific from her. But even as she spoke, she wondered if she was fooling herself, creating elaborate justifications for what was really just anxiety about marriage and childbirth, and losing her identity to husband and family. Uncle Thomas's family stayed for 2 weeks, and their departure left the manor feeling empty and quiet. Catherine missed Alice's chatter, even though it had sometimes been overwhelming. Edward missed his older cousin's company and the military instruction they'd provided. Elena missed her sister-in-law's help with household management. Lord William missed his brother's jokes and stories. The manor had seemed too crowded during the visit, but now it seemed too empty, the silence oppressive rather than peaceful. May brought the busiest time of agricultural year. Everything that would feed the estate through next winter was growing now, and every plant needed attention. Weeding was constant, backbreaking labor that occupied everyone capable of bending over and pulling unwanted plants. Irrigation required maintaining ditches and managing water flow to ensure all fields received adequate moisture. Animals needed to be moved between pastures, giving each area time to recover before being grazed again. The work was endless, relentless, exhausting. Edward spent more time in the fields than the practice yard that month, recognizing that agricultural labor was urgent while martial training could wait. Sir Robert approved this priority, noting that a lord who let crops fail because he was too busy playing with swords was no lord at all. Responsibility meant doing what was necessary rather than what was enjoyable, meeting obligations even when, especially when, they conflicted with personal desires. One afternoon in mid-May, while Edward was working in the wheat fields, a messenger arrived at the manor bearing a summons from the king. Lord William was commanded to provide military service, to send knights and men-at-arms to support English forces in France. The summons wasn't unexpected. Such calls came periodically, part of the feudal obligations binding lord and king, but it was still significant, requiring careful preparation and planning. That evening, Lord William gathered his household to announce the news. He would lead a contingent of 20 men, 4 knights including himself, 6 mounted men-at-arms and 10 archers, to France within 6 weeks. They would serve for 40 days, the traditional length of feudal military service, though Lord William could negotiate to extend that if needed. Sir Robert would lead the group, with Edward accompanying them not as a combatant, but as an observer and assistant, continuing his military education in a real war environment. Edward's heart raced at this announcement. He was going to war, not in some distant hypothetical future, but in weeks. He'd see actual combat, not training exercises, but real battles where people died. The prospect thrilled and terrified him simultaneously. This was what he'd trained for his entire life, but now that it was actually happening, he felt utterly unprepared. Did he know enough? Was he ready? What if he failed, embarrassed himself, got someone killed through his incompetence? Sir Robert found Edward later that evening, saw the anxiety written on his face and spoke to him plainly. "You're scared. Good. Only fools aren't scared before their first battle. Fear keeps you alert, keeps you careful, might keep you alive. The key is not eliminating fear, but functioning despite it. Can you do that?" Edward nodded, wanting to believe he could, hoping it was true. Sir Robert clapped him on the shoulder. "We'll see, but I think you'll do fine. You've been well trained and you've got good instincts. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and you'll come home." The next 6 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Equipment had to be checked, repaired, or replaced. Weapons needed sharpening, armor needed fitting, horses needed special training. Food and supplies had to be gathered for the journey. Men had to be selected from among the estate's tenants, those capable of military service who could be spared from agricultural work. Lord William compensated families for the loss of their workers' labor, providing silver coins or reducing rent obligations. Catherine watched the preparations with growing dread. Her father and brother were going to war, to a place where they could be killed. She knew the statistics: more men died of disease than battle, but they still died. She could lose both of them, become an orphan at 15, watch her entire life transform in an instant. The possibility terrified her, made her cling more tightly to prayer as the only thing she could control. She prayed for their safety constantly, bargaining with God in ways she knew were theologically inappropriate but couldn't help. Keep them safe and I'll be a perfect nun. Bring them home alive and I'll dedicate my entire life to your service. Lady Alina maintained outward calm, but Catherine saw the fear in her mother's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. Alina had been through this before. Lord William had gone to war several times during their marriage, but familiarity didn't make it easier. Each time could be the last. Each goodbye could be final. You learned to live with that knowledge, but never became comfortable with it. The night before departure, the family gathered privately for a final meal together. No servants attended, just the 4 of them: William, Alina, Edward, Catherine, sharing food and conversation in the intimacy of family. They reminisced about happy memories, shared hopes for the future, carefully avoided talking about the dangers ahead. This might be their last meal together. None of them said that aloud, but everyone thought it, the possibility hovering over the table like a ghost. After dinner, Lord William spoke seriously to his wife and daughter about what would happen if he didn't return. Alina would be the estate's guardian until Edward came of age and returned from France. She would have full authority to make decisions, manage finances, represent the family's interests. He'd prepared documents making this legal and official, ensuring she wouldn't be challenged by male relatives who might try to seize control. Catherine would assist her mother and continue her education with Father Benedict. When Edward returned, William said when, not if, refusing to acknowledge other possibilities. He would assume lordship and life would continue. Night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the manor's nighttime sounds, wind in the trees, owls hunting, the crackle of the dying fire in her chamber, and tried to imagine life without her father and brother. She couldn't do it. They were too fundamental to her existence, too woven into every aspect of her daily reality. She prayed until words lost meaning, until she was just repeating please, please, please over and over, begging God for mercy she had no right to demand. Morning came too quickly. The men assembled in the courtyard, 20 warriors and twice that many support staff who'd travel with them: grooms, cooks, servants, a surgeon, a priest. They looked impressive in their armor and colors, Lord William's banner flying prominently, horses stamping eagerly. But Catherine saw beneath the pageantry to the frightened men saying goodbye to families, unsure if they'd ever return. Edward embraced his mother and sister, trying to be brave, trying to be the man he wasn't yet but was supposed to become. Catherine held him tightly, memorizing how he felt, how he smelled, leather and wool and metal and the soap he'd used that morning. "Come home," she whispered. "Promise me you'll come home." Edward couldn't promise that, no one could promise that, but he said it anyway because she needed to hear it. "I promise, I'll come back, we both will." Lord William kissed his wife in full view of everyone, a public display of affection unusual for medieval nobility. Alina didn't cry, maintaining the strength expected of her position, but her face was pale and her hands gripped William's arms desperately. "God keep you," she said, "and bring you home to me." William nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, then turned and mounted his horse before emotion could overcome duty. The company rode out, armor gleaming in morning sunlight, horses' hooves raising dust from the courtyard. Catherine and Alina stood watching until the last man disappeared around the bend in the road, until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, until there was nothing left but absence. Then Alina squared her shoulders, took Catherine's hand and led her back inside. "We have work to do," she said. "The estate won't manage itself. Come, daughter, let's begin." The months that followed were the strangest of Catherine's life. The manor felt wrong without her father and brother, like a body missing essential parts. But work continued because it had to. Fields needed harvesting, animals needed tending, buildings needed maintaining. Life persisted despite personal grief and worry. Alina threw herself into estate management with fierce determination, as if keeping busy could prevent bad news from arriving. Catherine helped however she could, learning skills she'd never bothered with before. She studied the account books, learning to read Thomas's cramped handwriting, understanding the complex financial relationships binding the estate together. She attended meetings with tenants, observing how her mother handled disputes and complaints, how she balanced firmness with fairness. She even learned basic veterinary medicine, helping treat sick animals because the usual horse doctor had gone to France with the military contingent. News from France arrived sporadically, carried by travelers or messengers passing through the region. The reports were fragmented, contradictory, often weeks out of date by the time they reached Thornbury Manor. English forces had besieged a French town. No, they'd lifted the siege. There had been a battle. No, just skirmishes. Casualties were heavy. Casualties were light. Every report sent Alina and Catherine into anxious speculation. Were there men involved? Were they safe? The not knowing was almost worse than bad news would be. Summer arrived, bringing long days and hard work. The harvest began in late July, every available person joining the effort to bring in grain before weather could destroy it. Catherine worked alongside field hands, swinging a sickle hour after hour, her hands blistering, her back screaming protest. But she welcomed the physical exhaustion because it left no energy for worry. At night, she fell into bed too tired to think, sleeping heavily until dawn required rising to do it all again. Father Benedict provided spiritual support through those difficult months, spending extra time with Alina and Catherine, leading prayers, offering what comfort theological reflection could provide. He spoke about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, about Job's patience through suffering, about Mary standing at the foot of the cross watching her son die. These biblical examples were meant to be encouraging, to show that God's people had always endured terrible trials. But Catherine found them somewhat depressing. Yes, Abraham and Job and Mary had survived their ordeals, but so many people didn't survive. For every story of miraculous deliverance, countless stories ended in death and loss. August brought the year's hottest weather and no word from France. The silence felt ominous. Surely by now they should have heard something. 40 days of service had long since passed. The men should be returning home unless they'd extended their service, unless something had prevented their return, unless the worst had happened. Alina tried to maintain hope, but Catherine could see it fading, replaced by grim resignation. Then on a sweltering afternoon in late August, a rider appeared on the road to the manor. Catherine was working in the kitchen garden when someone shouted, and she looked up to see people running toward the gate. Her heart hammered as she dropped her weeding tool and joined the crowd. This was it, news from France, for good or ill. The rider dismounted in the courtyard, and Catherine recognized him as one of the grooms who'd accompanied the military contingent. He looked exhausted, covered in road dust, his clothes worn and dirty. Alina emerged from the manor, moving fast despite her usual dignified pace. "What news?" she demanded. "My husband and son." The groom smiled, and Catherine felt her knees go weak with relief. "Alive and well, my lady. Both of them. Lord William and young Edward are safe. They're on their way home, maybe a week behind me. They sent me ahead to let you know." Alina swayed, and Catherine caught her arm, steadying her. Around them, people were cheering, crying, praising God. The nightmare was over. They were coming home. The next week passed in frantic preparation. The manor had to be readied for Lord William's return. Rooms had to be aired and cleaned. Special meals had to be planned. Everything had to be perfect. Alina was transformed, energy and hope returning after months of barely suppressed despair. Catherine helped with the preparations, but spent much of her time in the chapel, praying thanksgiving for answered prayers, promising God she'd keep her vow to pursue religious life. 7 days after the messenger arrived, the military company rode into view. They looked different from when they'd left, thinner, harder, older somehow. Their armor was dented and stained. Their horses were tired. They carried themselves with a wary confidence that comes only from surviving genuine danger. But they were alive. That was all that mattered. Catherine waited in the courtyard with her mother and the entire household, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She saw her father first, recognizable despite changes, and then Edward riding beside him. Her brother looked taller, or maybe he just carried himself differently. His face was tanned, marked by a scar above his left eye that hadn't been there before. He'd become a man during those months in France, crossed some invisible threshold from boy to adult. Lord William dismounted and swept Alina into an embrace that made the watching household tactfully look away. Edward dismounted more slowly, wincing slightly, and Catherine noticed he favored his left leg. She ran to him, propriety forgotten, and hugged him fiercely. He hugged her back, laughing. "Careful, I'm kind of banged up." But he didn't let go, holding his sister like she was the most precious thing in the world. That evening, after the household feast celebrating their return, the family gathered privately. Lord William and Edward told stories about their experiences in France, the siege they'd participated in, the skirmishes they'd fought, the boredom and discomfort and occasional terror of military life. Edward showed them his scar, earned when a French crossbow bolt grazed his forehead during a raid. A hand's width lower and it would have killed him. Sir Robert had saved his life, pulling him behind cover when he froze in his first experience under enemy fire. "I was so scared," Edward admitted, something he never would have said before going to war. "The first time someone shot at me for real, I just stood there like an idiot. I couldn't move, couldn't think. If Sir Robert hadn't grabbed me, I'd be dead." Lord William nodded, understanding. Every warrior experiences that. Fear is natural. What matters is learning to function despite it, and you learned. Sir Robert says you did well after that first shock, that you're going to be a fine knight." The praise pleased Edward, but Catherine saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, knowledge of his own mortality, awareness that he'd come close to dying and might die next time. War had changed him, taken away whatever innocence he'd still possessed, replaced it with hard-won wisdom. She grieved for the boy he'd been while welcoming the man he'd become. The next morning, Catherine requested a private meeting with her father. They walked together through the manor's gardens, now overgrown after weeks of neglect, discussing how much had changed during his absence. Then Catherine raised the real subject, her desire to enter religious life. A year had passed since their first conversation about it. She'd continued discerning, continued praying, and her conviction had only strengthened. She was ready to take concrete steps toward joining a convent. Lord William listened, then was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "France taught me things I hadn't understood before. I saw men die good men for causes they barely understood. I realized life is short and uncertain, that we're owed nothing, that every day is a gift. If you're certain this is what you want, truly certain, then I won't stand in your way. I'd rather you live authentically pursuing your calling than miserably fulfilling my expectations." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Father." They embraced, and Lord William whispered, "You'll always be my daughter. Always. Whatever habit you wear, whatever walls surround you, you're mine and I love you." Catherine nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak past her tears. The practical arrangements took months to finalize. Religious houses didn't simply accept anyone who knocked on their door. They required dowries, references, evidence of genuine vocation. Lord William began correspondence with several convents within reasonable distance, seeking one that would suit Catherine's intellectual interests and spiritual temperament. Eventually, they identified a Benedictine house 30 miles away, known for scholarship and serious monastic discipline. In late October, Catherine and her parents traveled to visit the convent and meet with the abbess. The buildings were old stone, weathered by centuries, surrounded by walls that separated the religious community from the secular world. The abbess was a formidable woman named Margaret, 60 years old, her face lined by decades of prayer and fasting, but her eyes sharp and intelligent. She interviewed Catherine extensively, probing her motivations, testing her knowledge of Latin and theology, assessing whether she truly understood what religious life entailed. At the end of the interview, Abbess Margaret smiled. "You'll do well here, I think. You have the intelligence and discipline we value, and I sense genuine calling rather than fear of worldly life. If your father provides the required dowry and you survive your novitiate year, you'll make a fine Benedictine nun." Catherine felt joy and terror simultaneously. This was really happening. Her entire life was about to change irrevocably. She would enter the convent after Christmas, giving her a few more months with her family before permanent separation. Medieval nuns rarely left their houses once professed, and family visits were strictly limited. This wasn't like going away to school. It was more like dying to your old life and being reborn into a new one. Catherine would become Sister Catherine, her entire identity transformed, her previous existence left behind. The months before Catherine's entrance were bittersweet. Everyone tried to make them special, creating memories to sustain the family through coming separation. They did things they'd done when Catherine was a child, walked favorite paths, sang favorite songs, told favorite stories. Elena taught Catherine final domestic skills, as if somehow these would be relevant in convent life. Edward sparred with her verbally, their old pattern of witty banter returning one last time. Christmas that year was especially poignant. Catherine participated in all the traditional celebrations, knowing they were her last. Next year she'd observe Christmas in the convent, a quieter, more contemplative celebration than the manor's exuberant feasting and games. She tried to memorize everything, how the Yule log smelled burning, how the great hall looked decorated with evergreens, how her family's faces glowed in firelight, how the Christmas feast tasted, how the hymns sounded echoing off stone walls. On Epiphany evening, as the Christmas season ended, Catherine stood in the chapel and whispered goodbye to this phase of her life. Tomorrow, preparations for her departure would begin in earnest. But tonight, she could still be just Catherine, Lord William's daughter, Edward's sister, part of Thornbury Manor's household. She savored these final hours of ordinariness, knowing how precious they were because they'd never come again. January brought the day of departure. Catherine dressed in traveling clothes, packed her few possessions, mostly books and writing materials, and said goodbye to the manor that had been her entire world for 15 years. Servants she'd known her whole life hugged her, crying openly. Old Margaret held her for a long moment, whispering blessings and advice. Father Benedict gave her a small book of hours, beautifully illuminated as a parting gift. "To remind you of home," he said, "and of how proud we are of you." The journey to the convent took 2 days on horseback. Catherine rode between her parents, Edward following with a small escort. They stayed overnight at an inn, their last night as a complete family. No one slept much. They talked until late, then lay awake listening to each other breathe, reluctant to surrender consciousness because sleep brought them closer to goodbye. They arrived at the convent in early afternoon. The heavy wooden gate swung open, and Catherine saw nuns moving through the courtyard, their black and white habits making them look like a flock of birds. Abbess Margaret greeted them warmly, showing them the church, the cloister, the dormitory where Catherine would sleep. Everything was clean, orderly, peaceful. This would be Catherine's home now, these strangers her family. The final goodbye happened in the convent's visiting parlor, a room designed for limited contact between nuns and outsiders. Through an iron grille, Catherine could see her family's faces but couldn't touch them. Elena was crying silently, tears streaming down her face unchecked. Lord William looked older than Catherine had ever seen him, as if he'd aged years in hours. Edward stared at the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "I love you," Catherine said. "All of you, thank you for everything. Thank you for letting me follow this path." Her voice broke and she couldn't continue. Elena reached toward the grille as if she could somehow touch her daughter through the iron bars. "We love you, always. You're always our Catherine, no matter what name they give you here." The visit had to end. The abbess gently indicated it was time for Catherine's family to leave. They left slowly, looking back repeatedly, until finally they passed through the gate and it closed behind them with finality that echoed like thunder. Catherine stood alone in the parlor, truly alone for perhaps the first time in her life, and felt the weight of her choice settle on her shoulders. But beneath the grief and fear and uncertainty, she felt something else, peace. This was right. This was where she was supposed to be. God had called her here and she'd answered. Whatever came next, whatever challenges and sorrows and joys awaited, she would face them with faith. The future was unknown, but it was hers, chosen rather than imposed. That made all the difference. The years passed. Catherine completed her novitiate and took her final vows, becoming Sister Mary Catherine. She studied Latin and theology, becoming known in the convent for her sharp mind and deep spiritual insight. She copied manuscripts, her beautiful handwriting preserving texts for future generations. She prayed the hours faithfully, her voice joining the community's chant rising to God day after day, year after year. Edward became a knight and eventually inherited his father's estates when Lord William died peacefully in his sleep at age 68. Edward proved to be a wise and just lord, remembering the lessons his father taught, balancing strength with compassion. He married well, had children who filled Thornbury Manor with noise and laughter, continued the family line. Elena lived to see her grandchildren, finding joy in them that compensated somewhat for Catherine's absence. She visited the convent twice a year, speaking with her daughter through the iron grille, sharing news from home. The visits were bittersweet but precious to both women. Elena died in her 70s, surrounded by family, content that she'd lived well and left a good legacy. Sister Mary Catherine lived into old age herself, becoming the convent's prioress and eventually its abbess, leading the community with wisdom born from decades of prayer and experience. She never regretted her choice, never wished she'd chosen differently, though she sometimes missed her family with an ache that never entirely faded. She'd found what she was searching for, a life of meaning, purpose, and service to God. And every Christmas, as the seasons cycled round, Sister Mary Catherine remembered that long ago Christmas at Thornbury Manor when she was 15, and the world was full of possibility. She remembered the Yule log burning, the great feasts, the games and songs, her family all together and alive and happy. Those memories sustained her through difficult times, reminding her where she came from, who she'd been before she became who she was. The medieval world that Catherine inhabited no longer exists. The manor houses have mostly crumbled to ruins or been rebuilt beyond recognition. The churches remain but serve congregations who celebrate Christmas very differently from their medieval ancestors. The vast majority of people from Catherine's time are utterly forgotten, their lives unrecorded, their stories lost to history. But the essential human experiences they lived through remain the same. Love and loss, joy and sorrow, faith and doubt, hope and fear, the struggle to find meaning in difficult circumstances, the desire to live authentically despite social pressure, the tension between duty and desire, between what we want and what we believe we should do. Medieval Christmas celebrations can teach us about our own times if we're willing to listen. They remind us that community matters more than individual consumption, that authentic celebration requires both joy and seriousness, that the sacred and mundane aren't separate but intimately connected. They challenge our assumption that newer is better, that modern ways are the only ways, that progress is linear rather than cyclical. They also remind us that life is short and uncertain, that we are owed nothing, that every day is a gift. Medieval people understood mortality in ways we've largely forgotten, living with death as a constant companion rather than something hidden away in hospitals and nursing homes. This awareness of life's fragility made them appreciate its joys more fully, celebrate more wholeheartedly, love more fiercely. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, surrounded by whatever comforts or challenges your modern life contains, consider the lives of those medieval people. Catherine and Edward, Lord William and Lady Elena, old Margaret and Father Benedict, Sir Robert and Thomas the steward. They all lived, loved, struggled, died. They faced problems we can barely imagine while also dealing with universal human experiences we immediately recognize. Their Christmas celebrations were different from ours in countless ways. No electric lights or plastic decorations, no recorded music or mass-produced gifts, no social media posts documenting every moment. But the underlying impulse was the same: to create light in darkness, to foster community in isolation, to celebrate hope despite life's hardships, to remind ourselves that we're part of something larger than our individual existence. Medieval Christmas teaches us that celebration doesn't require wealth or ease, that joy can coexist with hardship, that meaning emerges from community and ritual and shared faith rather than from material abundance. These lessons feel especially relevant now, in our fractured, individualistic, consumer-driven culture. We've gained much since medieval times: comfort, health, knowledge, freedom, but we've also lost things worth recovering. The story I've told tonight is one story among millions from the medieval period, just a glimpse into a vast, complex civilization that lasted centuries and touched continents. Catherine's life was unique to her, but it also exemplifies patterns common across medieval Europe: young women choosing religious life, families navigating social hierarchies, communities celebrating seasonal festivals, people trying to live faithful lives despite constant challenges. If this story has resonated with you, if it's helped you relax into sleep or given you new appreciation for historical peoples and their lives, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Subscribe to Dreamless Timelines so you never miss future historical journeys. Share this video with others who might enjoy it. Your support makes this work possible and meaningful. And now, as the story draws to its close, imagine yourself back at Thornbury Manor one final time. It's Christmas Eve, a century after Catherine's time. Her great-great-grandchildren are celebrating much as she did, maintaining traditions passed down through generations. The Yule log burns. The great hall smells of roasted meat and spiced wine. People sing the same carols Catherine sang, tell similar stories, play similar games. Time is cyclical, the wheel turning endlessly, seasons repeating, generations succeeding generations. Individual lives are brief candles in vast darkness, but together they create light enough to see by. The manor will stand for centuries more, witnessing countless Christmases, sheltering countless lives. And somewhere in whatever existence continues after death, Catherine and Edward and their parents watch approvingly, pleased that their traditions continue, that their lives mattered, that they're not entirely forgotten. Sleep now if you haven't already. Let your mind drift through medieval halls and ancient rituals. Dream of Yule logs and wassail, of knights and nuns, of a time when life was harder but somehow simpler, when faith was stronger and community closer. Dream of finding your own path despite obstacles, of living authentically despite pressure to conform, of creating meaning in difficult circumstances. And when you wake tomorrow in your modern world with its modern problems and possibilities, carry with you some echo of medieval wisdom. Celebrate community, honor tradition while remaining open to change. Remember that life is short and precious. Live faithfully according to your own deepest convictions. Create light in darkness however you can, wherever you are. The medieval Christmas celebrations are over, faded into history, but their spirit continues, transmitted through centuries, touching us still if we're willing to receive it. That continuity connects us to Catherine and Edward, to all who came before, to all who will come after. We're part of an unbroken chain stretching back through time and forward into an unknown future. That's worth celebrating. Good night, peaceful traveler through history. May your dreams be full of wonder and your sleep be deep and restorative. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval Christmas. Until next time, this is Dreamless Timelines, helping you drift through the past on your way to rest. Sleep well.